The transmission began like any other, a routine check-in from the farthest edges of the world, but it ended in a silence that felt like a physical blow. Captain Eva Rostova leaned forward in the dimly lit briefing room, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the cold metal table. The audio file, marked with Sergeant Miller's call sign, crackled through the high-fidelity speakers, a stark contrast to the sterile, sound-absorbing walls of the underground command center. For the first 30 seconds, it was standard procedure: weather conditions, supply levels, a note about unusual seismic activity. Then the professional cadence of Miller's voice fractured. Static erupted, a wave of digital distortion that washed over his words. Eva's eyes met those of the grim-faced General Hayes standing at the head of the table. Beneath the hiss and pop, a new sound emerged, a low, wet, rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being dragged across compacted snow. Miller's voice returned, but it was a whisper, strained and thin, stripped of its military bearing. He wasn't speaking to his comms unit anymore. He was talking to himself, a frantic, panicked mantra. "It's so quiet out here. Too quiet. The ice, it's singing." The recording cut to a burst of pure, screaming static that made everyone in the room flinch, and then absolute silence. The mission parameters were simple, deceptively so. Find Sergeant Miller. He had vanished 72 hours ago from a remote U.S. geological research outpost in Antarctica. His last known coordinates were a pinprick on a vast, white map that dominated the wall screen, a place of such extreme isolation that the very concept of neighbors was meaningless. General Hayes laid out the facts with a clipped, efficient tone that failed to mask his own unease. Miller's vitals, monitored via his smart suit, had shown erratic spikes in heart rate and cortisol levels in the hours leading up to his disappearance, followed by a sudden, simultaneous failure of all biometric sensors. No distress signal was ever sent. The research outpost's own automated systems continued to report nominal status for another 6 hours after Miller's last transmission, a ghost in the machine maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Eva's team, an elite hand-picked unit for high-risk environmental rescue, was being deployed into the void left by those anomalies. She saw the assignment for what it was: not a rescue, but a recovery. A body recovery. Yet the strangeness of the data, the unnatural quality of that final transmission, seeded a different kind of dread. This wasn't a simple case of a man succumbing to the elements or a critical equipment failure. The silence that followed Miller's last words felt less like an absence and more like a presence, a patient, listening thing on the other end of a severed line. She looked at the faces of her team, their profiles illuminated by the cool blue light of the data screens. They were the best, trained for the worst the planet could throw at them. But as Eva stared at the frozen wasteland on the map, a landscape that could swallow continents and hide secrets for millennia, she felt a cold certainty settle in her gut. They weren't just going to retrieve a lost soldier. They were being sent to peel back a layer of the world, and they had no idea what they would find shivering beneath the ice. The world outside the reinforced porthole dissolved from the familiar greens and browns of a New Zealand airbase into an endless, searing white. The C-130 Hercules, a hulking beast of a plane retrofitted for polar extremes, thrummed with a vibration that resonated deep in Eva's bones. It was a sound of raw power battling an even rawer environment, a metallic roar against the profound silence of the southern continent. Below, the ice sheet sprawled like a frozen galaxy, its surface scarred by pressure ridges that cast long, indigo shadows in the low-hanging sun. This was not a landscape. It was an entity. Ancient and immense, and it tolerated their intrusion with a cold indifference that was more unsettling than any active hostility. Within the cavernous, unpressurized hold, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of jet fuel, cold metal, and the faint, sterile scent of pre-breathed oxygen. Strapped into webbed seating along the fuselage, the team was a study in controlled readiness. To Eva's right, Liam, their tech expert, was a portrait of focused intensity. His fingers danced across the screen of a ruggedized tablet, his brow furrowed as he cross-referenced the anomalous data from Miller's transmission with real-time atmospheric readings. He was a man who spoke in code and frequencies, his world one of clean logic and binary certainty, a stark contrast to the chaotic analog wilderness they were entering. A complex web of wires snaked from his pack, connecting various sensor suites, his personal arsenal against the unknown. Across from him, Sarah, the team's medic, methodically checked and rechecked her medical kit. Her movements were economical, precise, a calming ritual in the face of the impending void. Her eyes, a calm and assessing gray, occasionally flicked from her supplies to her teammates, cataloging, diagnosing potential stresses before they manifested. She was their anchor, the one who dealt in the tangible realities of flesh and blood, of frostbite and hypoxia, a necessary counterbalance to the spectral threat hinted at in Miller's final, fractured words. And then there was Alex. He filled the space around him, a mountain of a man whose sheer physical presence was a statement in itself. He was silently running a whetstone along the serrated edge of a survival knife, the rhythmic SHA-chick, a metronome counting down their approach. His role was simple, brutal, and essential, pure, unadulterated strength. He was their rampart, the one who would dig them out, carry them through, and stand between them and any physical danger the ice could conjure. As the plane began its long, gradual descent, the initial tension began to thaw, replaced by the quiet necessity of bonding before the isolation clamped down. Eva initiated it, her voice calm but carrying over the engine's drone, speaking of the mission's opaque nature, of the silence that was more frightening than any storm. Liam looked up from his tablet, his expression grim. He mentioned the static in Miller's transmission, a particular digital signature he'd only ever seen in deep space satellite interference, a phenomenon that had no business occurring at ground level. It was a piece of data that didn't fit, a splinter in the smooth surface of reality. Sarah nodded, sharing a story from a previous mountain rescue, a tale of a climber who had succumbed to severe altitude sickness, his babbling, confused reports of shimmering people in the snow eerily mirroring the unease they all felt. It was a story of the mind breaking under pressure, a reminder that their greatest enemy might not be outside but within. Alex merely grunted, sheathing his knife with a definitive click. His contribution was a story of a blizzard in the Rockies, of a 72-hour fight for survival where the cold became a sentient enemy trying to pry its way into their shelter. His point was unspoken but clear. The environment was a known, manageable foe. It was the unknown variable, the thing that made the ice sing, that worried him. In that shared space, rattling through the sky toward the bottom of the world, a fragile understanding was forged. They were a collection of disparate skills and personalities, a circuit board of human capability. Liam was the logic, Sarah the compassion, Alex the force, and Eva the will that bound them together. They were flying into a mystery wrapped in a wasteland, and their only certainty was each other. The white expanse below was no longer just a map location. It was a destination, a grave, and perhaps a nest. And they were plummeting straight toward it. The wheels of the C-130 met the ice runway not with a screech, but with a hard, percussive crunch, the sound of civilization making tentative contact with an alien world. The plane shuddered violently, a beast brought to heel, and through the porthole, Eva watched a plume of crystalline snow billow past, obscuring the view in a blinding, swirling white. When it cleared, McMurdo Station lay before them, a stark contradiction of human endeavor against an inhuman backdrop. A scab of low-slung, utilitarian buildings, fuel tanks and communication towers clung to the volcanic rock of Ross Island, all of it dwarfed by the immense, frozen expanse that stretched to a horizon lost in haze. The air that hit them as the ramp lowered was a physical shock, so cold it felt solid, leaching the warmth from their lungs with each breath and carrying the clean, sterile scent of a planet scrubbed free of life. They were met by a figure bundled in a thick red parka, his face mostly hidden by a fur-lined hood and goggles. He moved with the brisk, efficient gait of someone long accustomed to conserving energy in the deep cold. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris Chen, the lead glaciologist and the ranking scientist at McMurdo since Miller's disappearance. His handshake was firm, but his eyes, visible now as he pushed his goggles up, held a weary, haunted look that went beyond the usual strain of an Antarctic winter. He led them from the airstrip's biting wind into the relative warmth of a geodesic dome that served as the station's command and communications hub. Inside, the hum of servers and the glow of monitors provided a fragile sense of normality. Dr. Chen gestured toward a bank of screens displaying real-time environmental data, wind speeds, barometric pressure, seismic activity. His voice was low, laced with a scientist's frustration at phenomena that refused to be categorized. He confirmed the official reports of erratic data in the days leading up to the incident, but then he leaned in, his tone dropping further, sharing the concerns he had kept from the broader channels. He called up a graph on a central monitor, a spiking, chaotic line representing subglacial acoustic readings from the region of Miller's outpost. The signals were not just erratic, they were wrong. They were deep, resonant pulses that registered below the range of any known seismic activity, accompanied by higher frequency oscillations that Liam immediately identified as structurally similar to, yet fundamentally different from, bioacoustics of large marine mammals. They were sounds that shouldn't exist this far inland, this deep in the ice. Chen then pulled up a second data stream, a log of unexplained, low-power radio transmissions originating from the exact coordinates of Miller's last known position. The transmissions had begun after Miller's comms went dead. They were bursts of complex, non-repeating code, a ghost in the machine whispering secrets in a language no one could decipher. Eva watched Liam's face as he studied the waveforms, his usual confident focus replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. This was the anomaly given form, the static from Miller's transmission given a source. It wasn't random interference. It was a signal. A deliberate, patterned signal emanating from the ice where a man had vanished. Dr. Chen's final piece of information was the most chilling. Just 12 hours ago, a routine satellite pass had recorded a brief, massive thermal bloom at the outpost's location, a spike of heat intense enough to melt several meters of surface ice, followed by an impossibly rapid cooldown. It was the thermal signature of a volcano in a place with no volcanic activity, a fleeting fever in the frozen skin of the continent. Stepping back out into the punishing cold, the world felt different. McMurdo was no longer a safe harbor, but a fragile outpost on the edge of a vast, white mystery. The howling wind no longer sounded empty. It carried the echo of those unexplained signals, the memory of that impossible heat. They had landed on the ice, but the true nature of their mission had just solidified around them, colder and harder than the ground beneath their feet. They were not just searching for a lost man. They were investigating a wound in reality itself, and the ice was bleeding signals. The ghost in the machine had a home, a set of coordinates that glowed with malevolent promise on the high-resolution topographical map. Inside the cramped, equipment-cluttered ready room at McMurdo, Eva's team gathered around the central display, the sterile light of the screen casting their faces in pale, anxious hues. Miller's last known position was not just a point in the wilderness. It was a scar on the map, a shallow depression in the ice sheet that the satellite imagery rendered as a faint, almost circular bruise. Liam overlaid the data streams Dr. Chen had provided, and the screen erupted into a spider web of intersecting lines, the deep, pulsing acoustic anomalies, the bursts of cryptic radio code, all converging on that single silent spot. It was a vortex of wrongness, a place where the laws of physics and geology seemed to have taken a holiday. Liam then produced the physical evidence, the one tangible piece of the puzzle Miller had sent back before his world went silent, a series of ice core samples, sealed in transparent, vacuum-locked cylinders. He placed them on the table under a powerful magnifying lamp. At first glance, they were unremarkable cylinders of ancient, compressed ice, the frozen history of hundreds of thousands of years laid down in distinct, dusty layers. But then Sarah, with her medic's eye for minute detail, pointed a gloved finger. Embedded within the clearest sections of ice were not the expected specks of mineral dust or trapped air bubbles, but something else entirely. Fine, dark, thread-like filaments, thinner than a human hair, ran through the ice in complex, branching patterns. They were not random. They looked vascular, organic, a frozen fossil of some vast subterranean mycelial network. The true horror, however, was revealed when Liam adjusted the lamp's spectrum to ultraviolet. The filaments glowed. A soft, sickly bioluminescence pulsed within the ice, a faint greenish light that seemed to throb with a slow, alien rhythm. It was a light that had no business existing in core samples drilled from the deepest, oldest, and most sterile ice on Earth. This was not a mineral deposit or a known extremophile bacteria. This was something that lived, that thrived, in a world of absolute zero and crushing pressure. Eva felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, a sensation entirely separate from the Antarctic chill. Miller hadn't just been studying ice. He had been drilling into something, and the samples he sent back were not just geological data. They were a warning, a piece of the thing that had taken him. The sense of something being profoundly amiss was now a physical presence in the room, as tangible as the frozen cylinders on the table. The coordinates were a trap, the ice cores were a message, and the eerie silence from the outpost was the answer. They were not preparing for a rescue mission anymore. They were preparing for an incursion. The team's movements became swift, deliberate, fueled by a new, grim purpose. They checked their gear with a renewed intensity. High-latitude survival suits were inspected for the smallest tier, communication gear was tested and retested, and the Snowcat's engine was given a final, thorough diagnostic. Alex loaded heavy-duty ice axes and powered drills, his usual stoic expression now set in a mask of grim determination. He was no longer just preparing to battle the elements. He was preparing to break through something else entirely. As the last of the supplies were secured in the tracked vehicle's cargo hold, Eva stood for a final moment in the relative warmth of the ready room, her eyes fixed on the glowing map. The coordinates were a beacon, and the strange, luminous filaments in the ice were the trail. They were heading into the white not to find a man, but to find what remained of him, and to confront the ancient, frozen intelligence that had reached out from the deep ice and pulled him into the silence. The trek to the remote outpost was no longer a journey. It was a descent, and they were all acutely aware that they might not be climbing back out. The world beyond McMurdo's fragile halo of warmth and noise did not simply begin, it consumed. One moment, they were within the rattling, diesel-scented confines of the snowcat, the tracked vehicle's heated cab a tiny bastion of humanity. The next, they crossed an invisible threshold, and the Antarctic interior swallowed them whole. The vehicle, a hulking orange beetle against the endless white, crawled forward, its tracks churning the surface snow into a fine, blowing powder that swirled in their wake like a phantom, following them into the void. Ahead, the landscape was a study in monochrome despair, a flat, featureless plain of ice that stretched to a horizon so sharp and distant it felt like the edge of the world. The sky was a dome of pale, milky gray, the sun a diluted smear of light that cast no shadows, erased all depth, and left them suspended in a disorienting, directionless sphere of white. Eva kept her hands steady on the controls, her eyes constantly scanning the featureless terrain and the instrument panel. The GPS was their only tether to reality, a digital lifeline in a world that actively sought to dismantle all points of reference. Liam, in the passenger seat, monitored the suite of external sensors, his brow furrowed as he noted the first signs of the environmental anomalies Dr. Chen had described. The barometric pressure was beginning a slow, erratic dance, dropping and rising in fits that defied standard meteorological models. The external thermometer, shielded from the engine, heat already read 40 below zero, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the vehicle's hull. For the first hour, the journey was marked by a tense silence, each member of the team lost in their own private calculations of risk and dread. The only sounds were the constant, low grumble of the snowcat's engine, the rhythmic crunch of its tracks, and the faint hiss of the climate control. Then, the wind began. It started as a low moan, a whisper that slithered through the seams of the vehicle, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Within minutes, the whisper escalated into a sustained, guttural roar. The snowcat shuddered as gusts hammered its side, each blast carrying a freight of microscopic ice crystals that scoured the windows, reducing the outside world to a raging, white opacity. They were driving blind, guided only by the unwavering line on the GPS screen, a pixelated path through a tangible nightmare. The wind's violence was terrifying, but it was the silence that followed the brief lulls between the gusts that truly unnerved them. In those moments, the roaring ceased so abruptly it was like a physical blow to the ears. The engine's rumble was suddenly deafening, and beneath it there was nothing. No sound of wildlife, no rustle of vegetation, no distant rumble of shifting ice. It was an absolute, suffocating silence, a vacuum of sound so complete it felt predatory. It was the silence Miller had described, the silence that had gotten inside his head. In those fleeting, breathless pauses, the white outside the windows no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Sarah, seated behind Eva, found herself compulsively checking her medical kit, her fingers tracing the outlines of syringes and vials of sedatives. The oppressive quiet was a psychological toxin, and she could feel its effects seeping into the cab. Alex, in the rear, had stopped his usual maintenance of gear and sat perfectly still, his massive frame tense, his head cocked slightly as if trying to parse a specific frequency from the nothingness. He was a man who understood tangible threats, but this creeping, formless unease was an enemy he couldn't grapple with. Eva pushed the snowcat forward, the vehicle's progress feeling infinitesimally slow against the continent's vast scale. The coordinates on the GPS inched closer, a digital countdown to an unknown confrontation. The escalating winds and the eerie, listening silence between them were no longer just weather conditions. They were a barrier, a warning system for the place they were approaching. They were driving deeper into the white, and with every labored rotation of the tracks, the feeling grew that they were not the hunters, but the hunted, moving steadily into the jaws of a patient, frozen leviathan that had been waiting for them all along. The coordinates led them not to a scene of destruction, but to a tableau of interrupted life, a pocket of time frozen solid in the heart of the endless white. The snowcat crested a final, gentle rise, and there it was, Sergeant Miller's research outpost. It was not a ruin, but a still life of sudden, absolute cessation. Three low, dome-shaped shelters, their white fabric almost indistinguishable from the snow, formed a loose triangle around a central area where a communal tent stood, its entrance flap torn and now stiff with rime. A skeletal communications tower, its guy wires thick with icy beards, speared the gray sky, silent and useless. No smoke rose from the vents, no lights glowed from within the domes, no tracks marred the pristine snow leading to or from the camp. It was a diorama of human presence, meticulously preserved and utterly abandoned. Eva brought the snowcat to a halt 100 meters out, the engines idle, a blasphemous intrusion upon the profound quiet. Through the scoured windshield, the camp appeared less like a place and more like a museum exhibit titled The Moment It Happened. Outside the largest dome, a folding table stood, its metal legs sunk deep into the ice. On its surface, a meal was laid out. A metal bowl held a lump of what had once been stew, now a solid, frost-rimed brick. A fork was embedded in it at an angle, as if the eater had been interrupted mid-bite. A half-empty mug of coffee sat beside it, the liquid within long since frozen, a dark, permanent stain climbing the ceramic wall. The scene was so mundane, so violently ordinary, that its preservation was more chilling than any obvious sign of a struggle. They disembarked into a cold that felt older and deeper than any they had yet experienced, a cold that seemed to have leached all warmth from the universe itself. The wind had died down to a faint, mournful sigh, allowing the silence to press in, thick and heavy. Their own breathing, amplified by the masks, was the loudest sound in the world. Cautiously, they fanned out, their heavy boots crunching on snow that squeaked like styrofoam under their weight. Liam moved toward the communications array, his gloved hand brushing a thick layer of frost from a control panel, his head shaking slowly at the dormant, dead equipment. It was Alex who found the first of them. A figure, crouched near the entrance to the main dome, huddled as if for warmth or concealment. The person was encased in a translucent shell of ice, a flawless, grotesque sarcophagus. Through the crystalline blur, they could make out the bulky shape of a standard-issue parka, the hood pulled up. One arm was outstretched, the hand splayed against the dome's fabric wall, fingers curled in a final, desperate clawing motion. The face was a pale, featureless oval beneath a layer of frozen condensation, but the posture was unmistakable, a pose of sudden, terrified alarm, a snapshot of a human being caught in the split second between seeing a threat and being consumed by it. A second figure was found near the snowcat garage, a smaller, open-sided shelter housing a parked and now useless vehicle. This one was standing but leaning at a precarious angle, one hand gripping the doorframe of the garage as if for support. The head was tilted back, the mouth a dark, open O in the ice-masked face, a silent scream preserved for eternity. The body was rigid, a statue of pure panic, frozen in the act of turning to run or to face something approaching from the white vastness beyond the camp's perimeter. Eva stood between the two frozen sentinels, her breath pluming in the still air. This was not the aftermath of a storm or a slow succumbing to the cold. This was instantaneous, A flash freeze of impossible speed and precision, a wave of absolute zero that had swept through the camp and captured its inhabitants in mid-action, turning living, breathing people into monuments of their own final moments. There were no signs of Sergeant Miller, but his absence was a louder presence than any of the frozen forms. The camp was a clock that had stopped at the precise moment of catastrophe, and they were now walking through its silent, horrifying gears. The mission to find a lost man had vanished, replaced by the far more terrifying task of deciphering what kind of force could stop time itself. The deeper they probed into the camp's frozen heart, the more the ordinary gave way to the unnervingly arcane. While the outer areas told a story of sudden, catastrophic cold, the interior of the largest dome whispered of a different kind of dread, one born of obsession and a dawning, incomprehensible horror. Eva led the way, pushing aside the stiffened fabric flap of the main shelter's entrance. The air inside was even colder, stale and heavy, smelling of frozen electronics, old coffee and something else. A faint, metallic tang like ozone and wet stone. The space was a snapshot of a working scientist's mind interrupted. A small desk was littered with data slates, their screens dark and dead. A portable heater sat in one corner, its power cord neatly coiled beside it. Useless. It was Liam who noticed the walls. The interior surface of the dome was not just fabric. It was lined with a layer of packed snow and ice for insulation, and someone had carved into it. At first, the marks seemed like random scratches, the idle doodles of a mind under extreme stress. But as their headlamps swept across the curved surface, a pattern emerged. The scratches were not random. They were symbols. A series of intricate, interlocking spirals, sharp angular lines that resembled crystalline structures, and repeating sequences of dots and dashes that were too deliberate to be natural ice fractures. They covered entire sections of the wall, carved with a frantic, desperate energy, some so deep they had scored the fabric beneath the ice. They were a language without a lexicon, a madman's geometry scrawled across the confines of his own prison. Sarah, drawn to the small cot in the corner, found the journal. It was tucked beneath a stiffened pillow, a rugged, waterproof notebook with Sergeant Miller's name stenciled on the cover. The pages crackled with frost as she carefully opened it. The early entries were the crisp, professional notes of a geologist, ice density readings, core sample analysis, weather observations. But the tone began to shift subtly about 2 weeks before his last transmission. The handwriting, once neat and measured, became progressively more erratic, the sentences fragmenting. He wrote of shifting pressure readings with no seismic cause and persistent, low-frequency hums that the equipment couldn't isolate. Then came the sketches. Page after page was filled with drawings of the same symbols they now saw carved into the walls. He had drawn them over and over in the margins on dedicated pages, sometimes with such force the pen had torn the paper. He was trying to understand them, to decode them, his notes devolving into frantic questions. Pattern repeats in core sample strata, predates any known civilization. What is the source? One sketch showed the spiral symbol superimposed over a rough map of the camp, with arrows pointing downward deep beneath the ice. The final entries were the most chilling. The professional detachment was completely gone, replaced by a raw, terrified scrawl. It learns, it watches. The symbols are in my head. I see them when I close my eyes. The last written words, smudged and barely legible, were, "It's not the cold that kills you. It's the silence after it speaks." Eva took the journal, the frozen pages feeling like shards of a broken man's soul in her hands. The connection was undeniable. The symbols on the wall, born from Miller's unraveling mind, were a direct response to a hidden threat, a threat he had been studying in the ice cores. He hadn't just been drilling for geological history. He had been tapping into something ancient and aware, and it had tapped back. The carvings were not vandalism. They were a warning, a last, desperate attempt to communicate a truth he could no longer contain in words. The frozen figures outside were victims of a physical phenomenon, but Miller in here had been the victim of a psychological one, his mind slowly colonized by patterns and presences from a world far older than his own. They were no longer just in an abandoned camp. They were standing in the epicenter of an infection, and the patient zero had left them a map of his madness, etched in ice and paper, pointing unequivocally down. The silence in the communications dome was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the hum of Liam's portable power unit and the faint, rhythmic clicking of his fingers on a keyboard. He had jury-rigged a connection to the outpost's primary console, bypassing its dead internal systems to access the solid-state memory banks that held the camp's final days. The air was thick with the smell of cold plastic and ozone, and the dim glow of the laptop screen illuminated his face, etching deep lines of concentration and dread. Eva stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, while Sarah and Alex flanked the entrance, their postures rigid, their eyes fixed on the white void outside the open flap, as if expecting the frozen figures to stir. Liam's voice was a low murmur, a technical incantation against the gathering fear. He explained that the logs were heavily corrupted, the data scrambled by a massive electromagnetic pulse that had coincided with the thermal bloom Dr. Chen had documented. It was digital scar tissue, and he was trying to peel it back. After several tense minutes, he isolated a series of audio files, time-stamped for the final 48 hours. He highlighted the last one, a file labeled simply Final Contact, its size anomalously small, as if the recording had been cut short by something more absolute than a lost signal. He hit play. At first, there was only the hiss of empty bandwidth, the sound of a dead channel. Then, Miller's voice emerged, but it was wrong. It was thin, stripped of its lower registers, frayed at the edges by static. He was reporting a minor equipment malfunction, his words professional but his breathing audible, short, sharp pants that clouded the microphone. The recording jumped, a splice in time. Miller's voice returned, but now it was a whisper, a confidential terror shared with the unfeeling machine. The drills, they hit a pocket, not ice, something else, soft. It bled, a black, viscous fluid that froze before it hit the ground. A long pause, filled with the sound of his ragged breathing and a new, subtle background noise. A faint, wet scraping sound like stone grinding against stone deep underground. Another jump. Miller's voice was now raw with panic, his military composure utterly shattered. It's moving. I can hear it moving beneath the snow, right outside the perimeter, a shifting, a slithering. The motion sensors are going crazy, but there's nothing on the cameras. Nothing but snow. The wet scraping in the background grew louder, more pronounced, a rhythmic, predatory sound that seemed to be getting closer. Eva felt a cold knot tighten in her gut, a sensation entirely separate from the Antarctic air. Alex had taken a step closer from the entrance, his massive frame blocking the light, his face a mask of grim foreboding. The final segment of the log began. Miller was sobbing, the sounds wet and broken. "Oh God, it's at the door. It's looking at me through the fabric." A terrifying silence followed, broken only by the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart, picked up by the microphone on his lapel. Then his voice returned, so quiet it was almost inaudible, a breath of pure, unadulterated horror. It looks like me." The recording ended not with a click or a burst of static, but with a sudden, sickening crunch of collapsing metal and tearing fabric, followed instantly by an absolute digital silence. For a long moment, No one in the dome moved or breathed. The words hung in the frozen air, more solid and menacing than the ice outside. "It looks like me." The phrase unraveled everything they thought they knew. This was not an animal attack or a geological disaster. The threat was intelligent, mimetic, and profoundly personal. It didn't just kill, it replaced. It wore the faces of its victims. The initial fear that had been a low hum in their veins since landing now crystallized into a sharp, specific terror. They were not just trapped in a frozen graveyard. They were being watched, studied, by something that could wear a friendly face, and the first seed of a devastating, paranoid doubt took root in the silence Miller had left behind. The sun, a weak and diluted smear on the horizon, finally surrendered, and the long polar night descended with the weight of a tomb lid closing. The transition was not a gentle fading of light, but an aggressive, chilling invasion of absolute black. One moment the world was a monochrome of gray and white. The next, it was a void so profound. It felt like a physical substance pressing against the snowcat's windows. Eva had made the call to remain at the camp, the risk of navigating the featureless, dark terrain far outweighing the dread of staying in this place of frozen death. The snowcat, parked in the lee of the largest dome, became their fragile metal womb against the encroaching dark, its engine and heater providing a thrumming, mechanical heartbeat in the silence. They had drawn the blinds, sealing themselves in the orange glow of the cab's interior lights, but the darkness outside felt alive, a patient, breathing entity that watched their tiny island of warmth. They ate a cold, tasteless meal in silence, the memory of Miller's final transmission, of his whispered horror, lying unspoken between them. The initial, sharp fear had subsided into a low, constant thrum of anxiety, a wire pulled taut in the pit of every stomach. It was Sarah who suggested watch shifts, her medic's mind prioritizing the need for rest against the primal need for vigilance. No one argued. The idea of all of them sleeping at once, of being unconscious and vulnerable in this place, was unthinkable. Eva took the first watch, sitting in the driver's seat with her parka wrapped tightly around her, a high-powered rifle resting across her knees. The cab was quiet save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of her sleeping team and the constant, low hum of the heater. She stared out into the blackness, her own reflection a ghost in the window, superimposed over the nothingness. For the first hour there was only the wind, a distant, mournful chorus that seemed to circle the camp without ever touching it. Then, as Liam's shift began and Eva tried to force herself to sleep in the cramped rear compartment, the first noise came. It was not the wind. It was a faint, dry, skittering sound, like coarse sand being dragged across the snowcat's armored undercarriage. Liam froze in the driver's seat, his hand hovering over the rifle. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped. He exhaled slowly, chalking it up to the settling of the vehicle or a trick of the wind. But a minute later it came again, this time from the other side, a persistent, scratching whisper directly beneath where Alex lay sleeping. It was the sound of something investigating, testing the integrity of their metal shell. By the time Sarah's shift began, the noises had evolved. The scratching was joined by a soft, wet, slithering sound, the same sound that had been the background chorus to Miller's final moments. It seemed to move in a slow, deliberate circuit around the snowcat, a predator patiently circling its prey. Sarah sat rigid, her medical training offering no comfort against this non-physical menace. She stared into the impenetrable black, her imagination painting horrors in the void, pale, humanoid shapes shifting through the snow, multiple sets of Miller's eyes watching from the darkness. The sounds felt personal, intimate, as if the thing outside knew who was inside, knew their fears, and was playing a slow, cruel symphony upon them. When Alex took the final watch, the atmosphere in the cab was thick enough to taste. The noises had not escalated into an attack, but their persistence was a form of psychological torture. The scratching, the slithering, the occasional faint, almost melodic tap against the hull. They were a reminder that they were not alone, that the camp was not empty, but teeming with a life they could not see. Alex, a man of action, found the helplessness of the situation maddening. He gripped his knife, his knuckles white, his every instinct screaming to burst out of the vehicle and confront the source of the sounds. But the rational part of his mind, the part that had heard Miller's recording, held him back. To go out there was to step into the thing's domain, to offer it a new face to wear. As the first faint hints of twilight began to bleed into the eastern sky, the noises ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The sudden, absolute silence was in its own way more terrifying. The entity, whatever it was done with its nocturnal reconnaissance. It had made its presence known, not with a roar but with a whisper. It had gotten inside their heads just as surely as it had gotten inside Miller's, planting the same seeds of paranoia and dread. They had survived the night, but they were no longer the same team that had arrived. The darkness had changed them, leaving them jumpy, hollow-eyed, and acutely aware that the greatest threat was not outside in the snow, but the corrosive doubt now scratching at the door of their own minds. The dawn that finally broke was a liar's promise, a gradual leaching of gray light into the black that did nothing to dispel the deep, psychic chill the night had left behind. The team emerged from the snowcat stiff-limbed and hollow-eyed, the memory of the scratching, slithering sounds still echoing in the quiet chambers of their minds. The frozen camp, once a tableau of silent horror, now felt actively malevolent, its pristine white surfaces hiding a shifting, unseen life. They moved with a new, jerky wariness, their heads constantly on a swivel, their hands never far from their weapons. The shared experience of the nocturnal siege had bonded them in fear, but it had also frayed the edges of their trust, making each of them an island of simmering paranoia. Alex, his massive frame taut with unspent adrenaline, volunteered to perform a perimeter check. The helplessness of the night watch had grated on him, and he needed the catharsis of action, the simple, physical reality of scanning the horizon for a tangible threat. He crunched through the knee-deep snow, his breath pluming in thick clouds, his gaze sweeping across the vast, empty plain that stretched out from the camp in every direction. The world was utterly still, the wind holding its breath, the silence so profound it felt like a held note before a scream. It was in that perfect, crystalline silence that he saw it. 100 yards out, standing at the edge of a shallow pressure ridge, was a figure. It was his own height, his own build, clad in an identical, bulky orange survival suit. For a single, heart-stopping second, Alex's brain registered it as a reflection, a trick of the light on a patch of wind-sculpted ice. But then the figure turned its head. It was his own face staring back at him from across the snow, every detail perfect, the strong jaw, the slight scar above the brow, the grim set of the mouth. But the eyes were wrong. They were flat, black, and depthless, like chips of obsidian set into the familiar features, holding no recognition, no humanity, only a cold, predatory curiosity. Alex froze, his rifle half raised, his mind scrabbling for purchase against the impossible sight. His double did not move, did not speak. It simply stood there, a perfect, silent replica, its head cocked at the same slight angle Alex himself used when listening for a faint sound. The world seemed to shrink, the vast white expanse collapsing down to the narrow corridor of space between them. A cold that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air seeped into Alex's bones, a deep, primal terror at the violation of his own identity. This was the confirmation of Miller's final, desperate question. "It looks like me." He blinked, a hard, reflexive shudder of his eyelids against the impossibility. When his eyes opened, the figure was gone. There was no sign of its passage, no footprints leading to or from the pressure ridge, only the unbroken, virginal surface of the snow. It had vanished as if it had never been, a phantom woven from frost and fear. Alex stood rooted to the spot for a full minute, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was a hallucination, a product of sleep deprivation and extreme stress, a waking nightmare born from the seed Miller had planted. But the image was burned onto his retinas, the flat, black eyes seared into his memory. The feeling of being so perfectly, intimately copied was a violation more profound than any physical attack. He turned and trudged back to the snowcat, his movements slow and heavy. When he reached the others, he found he could not form the words. How could he describe what he had seen without sounding like he was losing his grip on reality? He saw the questioning looks on their faces, Eva's analytical concern, Liam's skeptical frown, Sarah's medic's assessment. He merely shook his head, muttering something about the light playing tricks, the strain getting to him. But the lie was a fragile thing, and the truth hung between them, unspoken and toxic. The first mimicry had occurred, and with it, the first seeds of a devastating doubt were sown, not just about what was real in the world outside, but about what was real in the mind of the man standing beside them. The phantom of Alex's double lingered in the camp's frigid air, silent poison that seeped into every interaction. The team moved around each other with a new, cautious distance, their glances holding a fraction of a second too long, their conversations clipped and careful. The trust that had been their bedrock was now fractured, and into the cracks poured the chilling certainty that nothing, and no one, could be taken at face value. Eva, watching the subtle tension in Alex's broad shoulders and the wary flicker in Liam's eyes, knew they could not afford to unravel. They needed data, something solid and quantifiable to anchor them against the shifting tides of paranoia. The answer, she decided, lay not in the haunted camp but beneath it. Liam retrieved the ground-penetrating radar unit from the snowcat, a sleek, disc-shaped device attached to a backpack-mounted computer. Its purpose was simple: to see through the ice, to map the hidden contours of the world below their feet. As he powered it on, the low, resonant hum of the device joined the ambient silence, a sound of probing, technological intrusion into an ancient, organic quiet. He began a slow, methodical grid pattern, starting from the center of the camp and moving outward, the radar disc sweeping back and forth like a blind man's cane tapping for the edges of a bottomless pit. Eva walked beside him, her eyes fixed on the tablet screen he carried, which displayed a real-time cross-section of the subsurface, a chaotic jumble of rock, compressed ice layers, and voids. For the first hour, the readout showed nothing unexpected. The ice was deep, layered with the geological history of millennia. Then, as Liam passed over the area where Miller's drill rig still stood, a silent sentinel to his discovery, the screen changed. A massive, amorphous shape began to resolve itself from the chaos. It was not rock, not a pocket of water. The radar signature was wrong, its density and texture inconsistent with any known geological formation. It was a vast, shadowy mass, buried at least 50 meters down, its edges blurred and indistinct, as if it were somehow fused with the surrounding ice. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic return signal that the computer flagged as anomalous, a slow, deep heartbeat from the glacier's core. Liam stopped, his breath catching. He zoomed in, adjusting the filters to enhance the image. The mass was enormous, easily the size of a city block, and its structure was unnervingly complex. It wasn't a solid object, it was a labyrinth. The radar revealed a network of tunnels and chambers within it, a sprawling, subterranean hive of impossible geometry. And the composition, according to the spectral analysis, was flagged in blinking red letters: organic. High concentrations of carbon, complex hydrocarbons, and traces of unknown elements formed a biological signature that was both profoundly alien and terrifyingly familiar. This was no mineral deposit. It was a thing that lived, that grew, a leviathan sleeping in the deep freeze. Eva stared at the screen, the cold of the air forgotten, replaced by a deeper, more profound chill. This was the source. This was the entity Miller had unwittingly awakened, the architect of the frozen tableaus and the whispering mimics. The symbols carved into the walls, the luminous filaments in the ice cores, the thing that wore Alex's face. It all led here, to this cancerous growth buried in the planet's icy flesh. The decision that now lay before them was monumental, a choice between two kinds of peril. They could seal the data, retreat to McMurdo, and let whatever slept below continue its slumber, leaving the mystery and the threat intact, or they could excavate. They could break through the ice and look the ancient horror in the eye. The debate that followed was tense and hushed, conducted in the shadow of the radar screen's damning evidence. Liam argued for caution, for containment. They had confirmed the threat's existence and scale. That was the mission's objective. To dig was to invite confrontation they were not equipped to win. Alex, however, his jaw set and his eyes burning with a need to confront the thing that had stolen his face, argued fiercely for excavation. He saw it as the only way to fight back, to destroy the entity at its source. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, voiced the terrifying middle ground. If this thing could mimic, if it could learn, then it already knew they were here. Retreat might not be an option. It might already be digging its way up to them. Eva listened to them all, her gaze shifting from their anxious faces to the stark, white landscape, and finally back to the pulsating organic mass on the screen. The entity was not just a threat, it was an opportunity. A chance to understand a form of life that defied every known rule, to grasp a truth hidden for eons. But it was also a gamble with their lives, their sanity, and perhaps with the future of a world unprepared for such a predator. The weight of the decision settled on her, cold and heavy. They would not run. They would not hide. They would go down into the dark and meet the heart of the silence. The order was given, her voice steady and final in the frozen air. They would excavate. The decision to excavate was a line drawn in the snow, a point of no return that transformed the frozen camp from a haunted graveyard into a surgical theater. The air, already brittle with cold, now crackled with a new, focused tension. The team worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken dread. Liam directed the setup of the thermal drill, a formidable piece of machinery that used focused heat to melt through the ice with surgical precision. Its low, resonant hum, a direct challenge to the ancient silence of the glacier. Alex, his encounter with the mimic fueling a raw, aggressive energy, handled the heavy components, his muscles straining as he anchored the rig over the precise coordinates of the subterranean mass. The rhythmic thump of his hammer driving stakes into the permafrost was a war drum beating against the stillness. As the drill bit word to life, its tip glowing a fierce, cherry red, a plume of superheated steam erupted into the air, condensing instantly into a thick, obscuring fog that swirled around them like a shroud. The sound was an industrial roar, a violation of the pristine quiet, and it felt like they were committing an act of profound desecration. They were not just drilling for samples. They were performing an autopsy on the ice itself, cutting into frozen flesh to expose the cancer growing within. Eva stood at the edge of the operation, her eyes fixed on the widening borehole, the steam frosting on her goggles. Each meter the drill descended felt like a step deeper into the lair of a sleeping god, and the weight of her command was a stone in her chest. The first sign that they had breached something other than ice was a change in the steam. It turned from pure white to a faint, sickly gray, carrying with it a new smell that cut through the sterile scent of meltwater, a cloying, organic odor like damp earth, rotting fungi, and something metallic like old blood. Liam, monitoring the drill's sensors, called out a sharp warning. The density readings were plummeting. They had hit a pocket. The drill retracted, its work done, and a tense hush fell over the group, broken only by the hiss of residual meltwater refreezing. They leaned over the borehole, their headlamps piercing the swirling steam, illuminating the revealed cavity below. The sight that greeted them stole the breath from their lungs. The walls of the cavity were not smooth ice. They were a tangled, frozen tapestry of tendrils. Thick, rope-like structures, some as wide as a man's arm, others fine as spider silk, woven together in a chaotic, organic lattice. They were a deep, bruised purple-black in color, and their surfaces were strangely textured, covered in what looked like minute, crystalline scales that glittered in the lamplight. They were not plant matter. Their structure was too complex, too deliberate. They were neural vascular, a frozen nervous system sprawling through the heart of the glacier. Sarah, her medic's instincts overriding her revulsion, used a long, telescopic probe to carefully extract a small fragment. She laid it on a sterile tray, her hands, steady despite the circumstances, working under the beam of a portable lamp. The fragment was not a fossil. It was pliable, even in the deep cold, its texture like frozen leather. She scanned it with a handheld biosensor, and the device's screen immediately flooded with warnings and unknown chemical signatures. The biological material was a chimeric nightmare, composed of complex proteins and nucleic acid sequences that shared no common ancestry with any known life form on Earth. It was alien not in the sense of extraterrestrial, but in its fundamental, terrifying otherness. It was a form of biology that had evolved in isolation for millions of years, locked in the ice, following a rule book written in a language science had never seen. As Sarah turned the fragment over, the light caught its inner structure. Deep within the frozen tissue, a faint, greenish luminescence pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored the anomalous signal from the radar. The entity was not dead. It was dormant, and they had just tapped directly into its frozen veins. The dig had begun, and with the first glimpse of those impossible, fossil-like structures, they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer investigators on the periphery of a mystery. They were surgeons who had just made the first incision into a living, breathing nightmare, and the ancient, slumbering heart of the glacier had begun, ever so faintly, to beat in response. The tendril fragment, now sealed in a biohazard case, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, its faint green glow a constant, accusatory reminder of the violation they had committed. It sat on the central console of the snowcat, a corrupted heart at the center of their fragile world, and its influence bled outwards, tainting the very air they breathed. The initial shared dread began to curdle, fermenting in the close, heated confines of the vehicle into something far more insidious and personal. The entity was no longer an external threat. It was a poison in their bloodstream, and its first symptom was a deep, gnawing distrust. It began with Liam. He had always been a creature of precise routines and logical patterns, his movements as predictable and clean as his code. But in the hours following the excavation, a subtle shift occurred. He developed a new habit, a faint, almost imperceptible tap of his index finger against his thigh, a rapid, staccato rhythm that was out of sync with his usual calm. He would stop in the middle of calibrating a sensor, his eyes losing focus, staring at nothing for a long moment before blinking and resuming his work as if nothing had happened. When spoken to, his responses were a fraction of a second too slow, his words just a little too measured, as if he were translating them from a foreign language inside his head. Sarah noticed it first. Seated across from him during a tense, silent meal of rehydrated rations, her medic's eye, trained to spot the most minute physiological changes, caught the discrepancies. The tap-tap-tapping against his leg. The way he held his fork, his grip just slightly off from the comfortable, practiced hold she had seen 100 times before. It was nothing she could quantify, nothing she could point to as definitive proof, but the feeling was a cold worm of certainty uncoiling in her gut. This was not the Liam she knew. This was something wearing his skin, something that had studied him but had missed the most infinitesimal details. The accusation, when it finally burst from her, was not a shout, but a low, strained whisper that carried more weight for its quiet intensity. They were alone in the cab, the others outside on a perimeter check. "You're not him," she said, her eyes locked on his, searching for a flicker of the man she trusted. "You move wrong, you blink wrong. What did you do with Liam?" The reaction was not one of confusion or offense, but of a cold, flat stillness. Liam's face, usually so expressive in its focus, went blank, the familiar lines of his personality wiped clean. For a terrifying second, the man sitting across from her was a stranger, a hollowed-out puppet. Then the mask of Liam snapped back into place, but it was cracked, imperfect. His denial was too quick, his anger too sharp and theatrical. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the metal floor, and called her paranoid, sleep-deprived, accusing her of letting the stress fracture her mind. But the performance was flawed. The cadence of his outrage was just a hair too practiced, the emotion not reaching his eyes, which remained as flat and dark as the obsidian chips. In Alex's mimic, the argument that erupted when Eva and Alex returned was a wildfire fed by the tinder of their shared fear. Sarah stood her ground, her voice trembling not with uncertainty, but with a furious, terrified conviction, listing the tiny, broken pieces of evidence. Liam countered with cold, brittle logic, dismantling each point, labeling them the hallucinations of a traumatized mind. But his defense only deepened the fissure. Alex, his own encounter with the double making him a volatile ally, sided with Sarah, his large presence looming over Liam, his distrust a palpable force. Eva was trapped in the middle, the commander trying to hold her team together even as she felt the foundations crumbling beneath her feet. She saw the slight, unnatural stiffness in Liam's posture, heard the faint, alien rhythm in his speech, and the seed of doubt took root in her own mind. The trust that had been their armor was shattered. Every glance was now a suspicion, every casual movement a potential tell. The snowcat was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage filled with potential enemies. They were a team of 4, but in the chilling silence that followed the argument, they were utterly alone, each one isolated by the terrifying possibility that the person sitting next to them was not who they claimed to be, that the ancient entity beneath the ice had already begun its work, not by attacking from without, but by quietly, insidiously, replacing them from within. The argument left a residue in the air, a toxic mist of accusation and denial that no amount of ventilation could clear. The team moved around each other in the snowcat's cramped interior like wary predators, every gesture scrutinized, every silence loaded with unspoken suspicion. The fragile truce that followed the confrontation was a brittle thing, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and haunted, each of them starting awake at the slightest sound, their hands instinctively moving toward weapons, their eyes darting around the dimly lit cab to confirm the identities of the shadows around them. The morning revealed the first tangible proof that their paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Alex, his face still set in a grim mask from the previous night's confrontation, began his routine check of the excavation equipment. The thermal drill, the core sample cases, the ground-penetrating radar, all were present and accounted for. But when he went to retrieve the heavy-duty plasma torch, the one tool capable of cutting through the strange, organic tendrils they had uncovered, he found only an empty, frost-rimed case. The torch was gone. Its absence was a void in their meticulously organized gear, a silent, screaming alarm in the quiet camp. A swift, frantic search of the snowcat and the immediate vicinity yielded nothing. The torch had not been misplaced. It had vanished. The locks on the equipment case showed no signs of forced entry, which meant it had been opened by someone who knew the combination. The implications were immediate and chilling. The theft was an act of sabotage, an inside job. Someone or something within their circle did not want them to continue digging, or perhaps wanted the torch for a purpose of its own. The missing tool was more than an inconvenience. It was a declaration of war from within their own ranks. The discovery fractured the morning's tense silence into a chorus of renewed accusations and defensive posturing. Liam, his earlier calm now replaced by a defensive, coiled tension, immediately pointed out that he had no use for the torch, that his expertise lay in electronics, not metallurgy. His words were logical, but the delivery was too sharp, too eager to deflect. Sarah watched him, her medic's gaze clinical and cold, noting the way his eyes refused to meet anyone's for more than a second. Alex, his distrust of Liam now a burning conviction, loomed over the tech expert, his voice a low growl. Demanded to know what had really happened during the night. It was Eva who, striving for a sliver of objectivity, suggested they search for physical evidence outside. The decision to leave the relative safety of the snowcat was made with a collective, grim reluctance. Stepping out into the blinding white felt like stepping onto a stage for a play whose ending was already written in blood. The wind had scoured the camp overnight, sweeping the snow into new, sharp-edged drifts, but around the snowcat, the surface was a chaotic mess of their own footprints from the previous day's work. And then, Sarah saw them. A set of prints, distinct from the heavy, deep impressions of their own insulated boots. These were lighter, narrower, and impossibly precise. They led from the snowcat's rear equipment hatch directly toward the perimeter of the camp, where they simply stopped, as if the maker had been lifted into the air. But it was the shape of the prints that froze the blood in their veins. They were humanoid with a clear arch ball and heel, but they had only 4 long, slender toes and no discernible texture from a boot sole. They looked as though they had been made by a bare, alien foot, a perfect impression pressed into the snow with an unnatural, weightless grace. The team stood in a silent semicircle around the trail, the missing torch forgotten in the face of this new, more profound horror. The footprints were a message, a signature. They were not the tracks of an animal or the mark of the wind. They were the evidence of the mimic's physical form or one of its forms. It had walked among them in the night, a phantom with stolen features and silent, four-toed feet, and it had taken a tool from under their noses. The paranoia was no longer just in their heads. It was written in the snow, a trail that led from their door into the vast, white unknown, a chilling confirmation that the enemy was not only among them, but that it could wear a face they trusted, move with a silence they could not detect, and walk right into the heart of their sanctuary without making a sound. The discovery of the alien footprints was a verdict, a final, chilling confirmation that the threat was no longer a specter of paranoia, but a tangible, physical intruder that had violated their sanctuary. The team retreated into the snowcat, the fragile truce shattered completely, replaced by a watchful, armed standoff. The missing plasma torch was no longer just a piece of stolen equipment. It was a weapon in the hands of an enemy that knew them, that could move like them, that could be one of them. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was thick enough to choke on, a toxic brew of fear, suspicion, and the metallic tang of ozone that seemed to cling to the memory of those foretold prints. It was Liam's weather monitor that broke the tense silence, its alert a shrill, digital shriek in the cramped space. He stared at the screen, his face, for a moment, stripped of its recent strangeness, and showing pure, unadulterated alarm. A massive low-pressure system, a true polar hurricane, was consolidating to the southeast. It was moving faster than any model had predicted, a swirling behemoth of frozen fury on a direct collision course with their coordinates. The data scrolling across the screen was apocalyptic. Barometric pressure in a nosedive, wind speeds projected to exceed 200 kilometers per hour, and a temperature forecast that promised a flash freeze capable of turning exposed flesh to stone in seconds. This was not a storm. It was an extinction-level event, a wall of white noise and absolute zero that would erase their fragile camp from the ice as if it had never existed. The warning forced a brutal choice, a decision that cleaved through the layers of personal suspicion and laid bare the fundamental division in their ranks. Eva called a council of war, her voice cutting through the rising whine of the wind that was already beginning to test the snowcat's seams. They had two options, both terrible. Option 1, secure the site, batten down the hatches, reinforce the shelters, and ride out the storm here in the eye of the mystery, risking a direct confrontation with the entity while trapped in a metal coffin slowly being buried by the ice. Option 2, retreat. Abandon the camp, the excavation, and the answers they had bled for, and make a desperate, high-risk dash for the relative safety of McMurdo, a journey that would lead them directly into the storm's teeth. The debate was not a discussion, it was a fracturing. Liam, his fingers resuming their faint, staccato tap against his leg, argued vehemently for retreat. His logic was sound, cold, and unassailable. The storm's metrics were beyond survivable for a prolonged exposure. To stay was a suicide pact. He spoke of fuel consumption, navigation in zero visibility, the structural limits of the snowcat. But his eyes, as he made his case, kept flicking toward the borehole, toward the hidden mass below, and his arguments felt less like a desire for safety and more like a desperate need to put distance between themselves and the thing they had awakened. Alex, his distrust of Liam now a foundational part of his worldview, countered with raw, aggressive conviction. To run was to admit defeat, to let the entity win. It was what the mimics wanted, to drive them out into the open, to pick them off one by one in the whiteout. He slammed a massive fist on the console, making the whole vehicle shudder. His faith was in walls, in fortification, in facing a known enemy head-on. The storm was a force of nature, a known quantity. The thing in the ice was the real enemy, and he would not turn his back on it. His gaze, when it fell on Liam, was a clear accusation. The one who wants to run is the one who has something to hide. Sarah, caught between the two poles of logic and brute force, found her voice strained and thin. She spoke of medical realities, of the certainty of frostbite and hypothermia if they attempted the trek, of the psychological toll of being trapped for days in the shaking, roaring dark. But her eyes, too, were on Liam, studying him, diagnosing him. Her vote was not for a location, but for cohesion. They had to decide as a team, or the storm would be the least of their problems. The entity was already doing its work, turning them against each other, and the debate over the blizzard was merely the battlefield it had chosen. Eva listened, her own mind a war zone of conflicting instincts. Liam's data was irrefutable. Alex's courage was their backbone. Sarah's caution was their conscience. But beneath it all was the chilling knowledge of the footprints, the missing torch, the thing that wore faces. To stay was to be trapped with a shape-shifting predator. To leave was to be hunted by it across a frozen killing field. The wind outside was now a constant, rising roar, a drum roll for the approaching end. The blizzard was no longer a weather event. It was the final argument in a debate they were destined to lose, a force that would not only test their endurance but would exploit every crack in their trust, turning their sanctuary into a tomb and their escape route into a gauntlet. The choice was upon her, and whatever she decided, she was choosing which version of hell they would enter. The storm did not announce its arrival with a gradual escalation, but with a single, world-ending impact. One moment, there was the rising whine of the wind, a predatory promise on the air. The next, a solid, roaring wall of white slammed into the snowcat with the force of a freight train, lifting the multi-ton vehicle on its suspension and slamming it back down onto the ice. The world outside the windows vanished, erased by a maelstrom of swirling, horizontal snow that absorbed all light and sound, reducing the universe to the violent, shaking confines of their metal shell. Eva's decision had been made for her. There would be no desperate dash for McMurdo. They were trapped. Inside, the roar was a physical presence, a deafening, constant scream that vibrated through the seats and floor, making speech impossible. They communicated in frantic hand signals and shouted words that were torn from their lips and lost in the cacophony. The snowcat groaned and shuddered, its frame stressed by hurricane-force winds that sought to peel it open and scatter their warmth to the frozen void. Icing became an immediate, critical threat. Liam, his earlier strangeness buried under a surge of adrenaline-fueled competence, fought to keep the external vents and engine intake clear, his movements sharp and desperate as he monitored the life support systems. The heater, their only defense against the plummeting external temperature, was already struggling, its hum a frail counterpoint to the storm's fury. As the first hour bled into the second, the initial shock hardened into a grim, claustrophobic reality. The storm was a siege, and their resources were the walls. Eva took inventory, her heart sinking with each tally. Fuel reserves, drained by the need to keep the heater and engine running constantly, were falling faster than projected. Their food supply, meant for a mobile mission, was now a countdown clock. But it was the water that presented the most immediate crisis. Their primary external melting unit had been torn away in the first violent gust, and their internal reserves were dwindling. Thirst, a mundane enemy, began to sharpen the edges of their fear. It was in the relative lulls, the brief, terrifying moments when the wind's roar subsided from a scream to a guttural howl, that the other noises began. At first, they were dismissed as the protest of the snowcat's tortured frame or the shifting of snow drifts. But the sounds soon asserted their own distinct identity. The faint, wet slithering from their first night returned, now amplified, seeming to coil around the entire vehicle. It was joined by a new sound, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated up through the chassis, a subsonic pulse that made their teeth ache and their bones feel brittle. It was the heartbeat of the glacier, the rhythm of the massive organic mass beneath them, and it was growing stronger, as if the storm were not a barrier but a catalyst. Tensions, already frayed to breaking point by days of suspicion, now flared into open hostility in the cramped, roaring dark. The argument over the missing plasma torch reignited, a spark thrown into a room full of gasoline. Alex, his face a mask of fury and fear, rounded on Liam, his voice a raw shout barely audible over the storm. He accused him of sabotaging their retreat, of being in league with the thing outside, of being the reason they were now trapped and dying. Liam's defense was a brittle, high-pitched counteraccusation, his words laced with a venom that felt alien to him. He screamed that Alex's stubbornness, his brutish refusal to see reason, had doomed them all. They were inches from each other, two men who had once been brothers in arms, now reduced to snarling animals in a cage, their shared terror turning outward as rage. Sarah tried to intervene, her medic's instinct to calm, to soothe, but her voice was lost, her presence ignored. Eva finally had to physically step between them, her own authority the only remaining bulwark against total collapse. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with a sullen, armed truce. They retreated to their separate corners of the shaking vehicle, each one a fortress of isolated paranoia, the gulf between them now as wide and impassable as the storm outside. They were trapped, not just by the ice and wind, but by the terrifying certainty that the enemy was no longer just a phantom in the snow. It was inside with them, wearing a familiar face and biding its time as the storm slowly, methodically, began to bury them alive. The storm's fury was a living entity, a roaring white beast that held their snowcat in its frozen jaws and shook it relentlessly. Inside, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a trembling metal coffin, the air thick with the stench of fear, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of ozone that seeped in from the unnatural cold outside. The argument had left a silence more profound than the storm's roar, a chasm of distrust that yawned between the four figures huddled in the orange gloom. Each was an island, adrift in a sea of personal dread, their hands never far from their weapons, their eyes constantly performing furtive, paranoid checks on the others. It was during a temporary lull, a moment when the wind scream dropped to a guttural moan, that the new sound emerged. It wasn't the slithering or the deep thrumming from below. This was a voice, Eva's voice. It came from outside, seeming to originate just beyond the driver's side window, a perfect replica of her calm, authoritative tone cutting cleanly through the residual howl of the gale. Liam, I'm pinned. The antenna array collapsed, my leg is caught, I need your help now. Inside the cab, the real Eva froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. She had not spoken. She was standing by the rear equipment locker, her mouth agape in horror. Liam, seated at the comm station, jerked his head up, his face a canvas of confusion and alarm. The voice was flawless, imbued with just the right amount of strained pain and command. It was a siren's call, crafted from stolen memory and predatory cunning. Eva. Liam shouted, his voice cracking with stress. He looked frantically from the window toward where the real Eva stood, his mind clearly wrestling with the impossible. The mimic's voice came again, more desperate, more compelling. Liam, please, it's coming back. I can hear it moving in the snow. The entity was not just mimicking. It was weaving a narrative, exploiting their fears and their bonds. It knew Liam's loyalty, his technical drive to fix things, to save his team. It was using Eva's voice to bait the most logical mind into an illogical, fatal action. Liam's hand went to the door release latch, his fingers hovering over the lever. His reasoning was a visible war on his face. The captain was in trouble. The storm was momentarily quieter. He had to act. Don't. The real Eva's command was a raw, desperate scream, but it was too late. The combination of the convincing mimicry and his own fractured trust made him hesitate for a fatal second, his eyes darting to her with a flicker of doubt. Was the Eva by the lockers the real one? Or was it the mimic, trying to keep him from helping the real captain? That moment of hesitation was all the entity needed. With a grunt of decision, Liam yanked the lever and shoved the door open against the wind. A blast of frozen air and swirling snow exploded into the cab, carrying with it a fleeting, phantom impression of a pale, indistinct figure standing just beyond the veil of white. Then Liam was gone, swallowed by the blizzard, the door slamming shut behind him with a final, dreadful thud. For a heartbeat, there was only the storm's roar and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Then from the whiteness outside came a short, sharp cry, Liam's voice, cut off with brutal suddenness. It was followed by a sound that would haunt them forever, a wet, tearing crunch, and then a silence that was more terrible than any scream. The real Eva stumbled to the door, pressing her face against the freezing glass, but there was nothing to see. The storm had already erased any sign of the struggle. The mimic had not just lured a man to his death. It had demonstrated a terrifying, intimate intelligence. It didn't just copy appearances, it understood psychology. It knew how to use their own voices, their own loyalties, as weapons against them. The loss of Liam was a devastating blow, but the revelation of the entity's cunning was a deeper, more insidious wound. They were trapped with a predator that could speak with the voices of the dead and the dying, a shape-shifting horror that knew them better than they knew themselves. The storm outside was no longer the greatest threat. The real enemy had just proven it could reach inside their metal shell and pluck them out, one by one, using their own hearts as the lure. The storm's fury began to wane with the grudging slowness of a predator loosening its jaws, the roaring white chaos outside fading to a persistent, moaning wind. The absence of Liam was a physical void in the snowcat, a silence more profound than the retreating gale. His empty seat, the abandoned comm station with its blinking, useless lights, they were a monument to the entity's cunning. Eva, Sarah, and Alex moved through the aftermath in a state of shell-shocked dread, their movements mechanical, their communication reduced to terse, functional whispers. The entity was no longer a theory or a phantom. It was a murderer that wore stolen voices, and the knowledge sat in their guts like a shard of ice. They could not afford to be passive. Grief was a luxury that would get them killed. The storm's partial retreat offered a window, a fleeting chance to turn from prey to hunter. The plan was born from desperation and a cold, focused rage. They would use themselves as bait. The entity was a mimic, a creature of deception. They would exploit its nature, its need to observe, to absorb, to become. They would create a scenario of vulnerability, a carefully staged moment of isolation, and they would be waiting. They chose the communications dome, the place where Miller's truth had first been revealed. Its torn fabric flapped in the wind, a gaping wound in the camp's side. Sarah would be the lure. She would appear to be alone, tending to a fictional injury, her back to the open entrance, a picture of perfect, helpless vulnerability. Eva and Alex would be concealed in the frozen shadows of the dome's interior, buried under a tarpaulin amidst the wrecked equipment, their breathing stilled, their weapons ready. It was a gamble with Sarah's life as the stake, a brutal calculation made in the face of an even more brutal enemy. The trap was set as the weak, gray twilight began to bleed away into the long polar night. Sarah knelt just inside the entrance, her medical kit open beside her, her posture a careful performance of pain and distraction. She feigned tending to an ankle, her breaths pluming in the still, frigid air. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the only sound the mournful sigh of the wind and the frantic hammering of their own hearts. Eva, peering through a narrow gap in the tarp, felt the cold of the floor seeping through her suit, a numbness that was nothing compared to the chilling anticipation. Then it came. There was no sound of approach, no crunch of footsteps in the snow. One moment the entrance was an empty frame of flapping fabric and darkness. The next, a figure stood there. It was Liam. Or rather, it was a perfect, horrifying sculpture of him, clad in his orange survival suit, his face etched with a convincing mask of relief and concern. It was flawless, down to the small tear in his glove, the way his goggles were slightly askew. But its eyes, like the mimic that had copied Alex, were flat and depthless twin pools of obsidian that held no spark of the man they had known. "Sarah," it said, and the voice was Liam's, the exact timbre and cadence, layered with a believable strain of exhaustion. "Thank God. I got lost in the storm. I thought I was done for." It took a step forward, its movements fluid, eerily precise. From her hidden position, Eva gave the signal. As the mimic took another step toward the unsuspecting Sarah, Alex erupted from his concealment with a roar not of a man, but of a force of nature. He slammed into the figure, his massive arms wrapping around it in a crushing bear hug, driving it to the ground. The thing that wore Liam's face did not cry out in surprise or pain. It thrashed with a shocking, wiry strength, its limbs contorting at impossible angles, but Alex's grip was unbreakable, forged in grief and fury. Eva was on them in an instant, jamming a high-dose sedative syringe into the mimic's neck. The struggle intensified for a few more seconds, a violent, silent ballet of flailing limbs, and then the creature went limp. They had it. They dragged the inert form to the center of the dome, securing its wrists and ankles with reinforced polymer straps. It lay on the frozen floor, a perfect copy of their dead friend, a breathing, nightmarish mannequin. For a long moment they simply stared, their breath misting in the air, the reality of their capture slowly dawning. Then the transformation began. The features of Liam's face started to lose cohesion, the skin becoming translucent, wavering like heat haze on a summer road. The form beneath the suit seemed to deflate, the human shape dissolving into a pale, gelatinous mass that pulsed with a faint, internal light. It was neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, a primordial sludge that held infinite potential. As they watched, mesmerized and revolted, the mass began to shift again. It flowed like water, its surface rippling, and new forms began to flicker across its surface with dizzying speed. They saw Miller's terrified face emerge from the ooze, his mouth open in a silent scream, before it melted away into the features of one of the frozen camp members, then into a stranger, then into a bestial, sharp-toothed visage that belonged to no known creature. It was a kaleidoscope of stolen identities, a living library of forms, but it was more than just physical mimicry. As Sarah's face briefly surfaced from the shifting morass, the creature's formless head turned toward the real Sarah, and a perfect imitation of her own private memory, the sound of her daughter's laughter from a video call, echoed softly in the dome. The entity wasn't just copying appearances. It was absorbing memories, personalities, the very essence of its prey, storing them in its ancient, collective consciousness. The final, horrifying confirmation came when the mass stilled, and the form of Eva herself lay on the floor, bound and helpless, staring up at the real Eva with her own eyes. The mimic's lips parted, and it spoke in her voice, not with a threat, but with a perfect recitation of the last, private thought she'd had before falling asleep the previous night, a memory of a childhood home she had never shared with anyone. The entity had been inside their minds, listening, learning, harvesting. It was not just a shapeshifter. It was a psychic parasite, an ancient hive-mind organism that consumed identities to build its own, a living mirror that reflected not just the surface but the soul, and in the reflection it found the tools for its own perfect predatory deception. The reveal was complete. They were not fighting a monster. They were fighting a memory thief, an identity devourer, and it knew them better than they knew themselves. The gelatinous mass that had worn Liam's face, now shifting through a gallery of stolen identities on the frozen floor of the calm's dome, was more than a captive. It was a dark mirror held up to their souls. The initial, triumphant shock of the capture curdled into a deep, chilling horror as the entity's true nature was laid bare. It did not just mimic, it consumed, digesting memories and personalities to fuel its perfect deceptions. Staring at the bound thing as it cycled through their own faces and whispered their most private thoughts, Eva, Sarah, and Alex understood the full, devastating scope of the threat. They were not just outmatched, they were being psychologically dismantled, piece by piece. Retreat was no longer a choice. It was a biological imperative. Remaining in the camp was a slow death sentence, a guarantee that they would be picked off, their faces and minds added to the entity's grisly collection. Eva's command, when it came, was stripped of all nuance. Raw survival directive. They would abandon the camp. Their destination was a secondary research station, a smaller, automated outpost designated Zulu 7, marked on their maps as a 60-kilometer trek to the northeast. It was a speck in the wilderness, but it represented a chance, however slim, of finding functional communications, shelter, and perhaps a route off the ice before the entity completely hollowed them out. The plan they formulated in the shuddering confines of the snowcat was a tapestry woven from desperation and paranoia. It was simple, brutal, and fraught with peril. They would travel on foot. The snowcat was too loud, too visible, a sitting target for an enemy that could emerge from the snow itself. They would use the remaining daylight, a scant few hours of weak, gray twilight, to cover as much ground as possible before the full darkness, and the storm's residual fury forced them to hunker down. They would travel in a tight, defensive triangle, each person responsible for a 120-degree arc of vigilance, their weapons always at the ready. The rules of engagement were absolute. No one strayed from the formation, no one responded to a voice from the darkness, and any figure approaching without a prearranged, continuous visual was to be considered hostile. But the true core of the plan, its most fragile and essential component, was a system of verification. The entity's ability to perfectly replicate appearances made visual identification useless. They needed a key, a shared secret that could not be absorbed or mimicked. It was Sarah who proposed it, her mind, trained in diagnostics, latching onto a tangible metric. They would use a memory but not a spoken one. It would be a physical sensation, a specific, agreed-upon pattern of pressure. A tap on the left shoulder, followed by 2 quick taps on the right, delivered through the thick material of their parkas. It was a code simple enough to be executed without thought, yet complex enough to be beyond the entity's ability to observe and replicate in the moment. It was a handshake for the soul, a way to confirm that the person beside you was still human. The formation of this desperate alliance, however, was strained to its absolute limit. The pressure of their imminent flight acted like a centrifuge, separating them by weight and suspicion. Alex, his trust shattered by Liam's betrayal and subsequent death, viewed every interaction through a lens of hardened cynicism. He agreed to the verification code, but his eyes, when they rested on Sarah, held a lingering, unspoken question. Had her diagnosis of Liam been a lucky guess or something more? Had the entity missed those tiny details, or had it, in its perfection, simply not cared to replicate them until it was useful? He positioned himself as the group's rear guard, a role that allowed him to watch the others as much as the horizon. Sarah, in turn, found her own faith eroding. The entity's recitation of her private memory had felt like a violation more intimate than any physical assault. It made her question the sanctity of her own mind. Every glance she exchanged with Eva was now loaded with a terrifying subtext. Is the thought in my head truly mine, or is it an echo it planted there? Her alliance with Eva felt solid, a chain of command forged in fire, but the chain felt thin, liable to snap under the weight of the next deception. Eva stood at the apex of this crumbling pyramid of trust, her own mind a battleground. She had to project absolute certainty, to be the unwavering core around which their fragile plan could coalesce. But inside, she was reeling. The entity had proven it could weaponize her voice, her authority. How could she lead when her very commands could be used as a lure? She looked at Alex, a fortress of mistrust, and Sarah, an island of traumatized doubt, and knew that the 60-kilometer trek through the storm-racked ice would be more than a physical trial. It would be a gauntlet of psychological warfare, a test of their ability to trust a hand signal in the dark more than their own eyes, to believe in a shared, desperate lie of solidarity, while the truth whispered that anyone at any moment could be replaced. The escape plan was formed, but the alliances that would see it through were shifting like the snow outside, constantly under pressure from the ancient, patient intelligence that watched them prepare to run, and that knew with chilling certainty that it held all the best cards. The world beyond the camp was a freshly scoured nightmare, a landscape remade by the storm's fury into a featureless plain of hard-packed snow, broken only by the occasional, wind-sculpted dune that rose like the frozen spine of a buried leviathan. The sky was a lid of seamless, leaden gray, pressing down upon the ice with a weight that felt both physical and psychic. They moved in the formation they had agreed upon, Eva at the point, Sarah to her left, Alex a few paces behind as rear guard, a tight, human triangle trudging through a universe of white. Their progress was agonizingly slow, each step a battle against the crusted surface that threatened to collapse into the softer powder beneath, sucking at their boots with a greedy, whispering sound. The cold was no longer merely an environmental condition. It was a predatory presence, a billion microscopic teeth seeking any gap in their armor, any exposed sliver of flesh to gnaw and necrotize. The silence was the most unnerving weapon in the entity's arsenal. It was not the empty quiet of a vacuum, but a listening, intelligent silence, a held breath that seemed to absorb the crunch of their footsteps and the ragged saw of their breathing, throwing back only a faint, mocking echo. It was in this amplified quiet that the first deception began. A figure emerged from the haze of blowing snow about 50 meters to their right. It was Liam. Or rather, the perfect, heartbreaking replica of him, stumbling toward them, one arm clutching his side as if wounded, his other hand raised in a feeble wave. The likeness was devastating, a masterpiece of cruel artistry that targeted the raw, unhealed wound of his loss. "Eva, Sarah, I made it, I got away," the figure called, its voice a perfect mimicry of Liam's, layered with exhaustion and relief. The triangle froze. Eva's hand, hidden in her glove, formed a fist, the signal to hold. She did not look at the mimic. She looked at Sarah and Alex, her eyes hard and commanding through her frosted goggles. The entity was testing them, probing the strength of their new protocols. Alex's rifle was already half raised, his jaw a granite line of hatred, but he held his fire, his training and the prearranged rule overriding his instinct to destroy the thing wearing his friend's face. The Liam mimic took another step closer, its expression shifting to one of confused hurt. "Why are you just standing there? It's me, help me." Then, from the opposite direction, another voice cut through the silence, this one a raw, terrified shriek. "Don't listen to it. That's not me, I'm over here." A second Liam stumbled into view from the left, this one more disheveled, his parka torn, his face a mask of genuine-looking panic. The two identical figures now advanced from opposite flanks, their pleas and accusations creating a dissonant chorus of deception. It was a psychological pincer movement designed to shatter their cohesion, to force a choice, to make them doubt the very reality before their eyes. Eva did not hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired a single, thunderous shot into the air. The crack of the report was swallowed by the vastness, but the message was clear. She then pointed forward into the empty white and began walking again, a deliberate, unwavering pace. After a heart-stopping second, Sarah and Alex fell in behind her, their formation holding. They did not look back. They marched, their backs to the twin phantoms as the desperate, pleading voices behind them first rose in a crescendo of fury, and then, as they realized the ruse had failed, dissolved into a wet, guttural snarling that was utterly, terrifyingly alien before fading back into the listening silence. The trek became a gauntlet of such apparitions. An hour later it was Sarah's double that appeared, beckoning them toward a seemingly safe crevasse, its voice a perfect imitation of her calm medic's reason, explaining it was a shortcut. They ignored it, their verification taps passing between them in a silent, frantic rhythm. Left shoulder, right, a lifeline of touch in a world of visual lies. Then it was Alex's turn, a hulking, silent replica that simply stood in their path, blocking the way, its obsidian eyes challenging them to try and move it. They gave it a wide berth, their weapons trained on it until it was lost in the swirling snow. Each encounter was a hammer blow to their resolve, a test that drained a little more of their sanity and strength. The cold seeped deeper, their muscles ached with a bone-deep fatigue, and the constant, hypervigilant state was a fire burning through their mental reserves. They were being hunted not by a beast, but by a master illusionist, an enemy that weaponized their grief, their trust, and their very memories. The trek through the snow was more than a journey. It was an ordeal of the spirit, a forced march through a hall of mirrors where every reflection was a predator, and the only truth was the desperate, shared signal of a tap on the shoulder, a fragile code whispered against the skin, proving that for one more moment, against all odds, they were still human. The relentless march through the white void had become a waking nightmare, a slow erosion of body and spirit under the constant, watchful pressure of the unseen entity. Each footfall was a monumental effort, their muscles screaming in protest, their minds frayed by the gauntlet of familiar phantoms that had harried them for kilometers. The weak twilight was beginning to fail, leaching the already muted color from the world and painting the snow in shades of deepening blue and gray. They had just crested a low, wind-swept ridge, their bodies screaming for a moment's rest, when the final, most intimate deception began to unfold. It was a small thing, a detail so insignificant that under any other circumstances, it would have passed completely unnoticed. As they paused, their heavy breaths pluming in the frigid air, Alex reached for his canteen, his movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion. The cap was frozen, as it always was, and he grunted, using his massive, gloved hand to twist it open with a sharp, cracking sound of breaking ice. He took a long, slow swallow, the water already beginning to freeze in the mouth of the container. Then, as he went to reseal it, his hand performed a brief, fluid motion, a quick, clockwise twist followed by a faint tap on the side of the canteen with his thumb. Eva saw it, a cold that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air locked her joints. It was a habit, a tiny, personal ritual that the real Alex had performed 1,000 times, a superstitious gesture left over from his mountaineering days, a silly little charm for sealing in the warmth. He'd even joked about it once back in the C-130, calling it his lucky twist. The entity, for all its perfection, for all its absorption of memories and mannerisms, had missed this one, infinitesimal detail. The Alex standing beside her had just sealed his canteen with a simple, efficient counterclockwise turn. No twist, no tap. The realization did not dawn, it detonated. Every strange look, every moment of heightened aggression, every subtle shift in his posture over the past days crashed together in her mind, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. The real Alex, the man of brute force and unwavering loyalty, was gone. This thing, this mimic, had been walking with them, sharing their air, standing guard over their sleep, all while wearing the face of their protector. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply personal that it stole the breath from her lungs. She didn't dare speak. She didn't dare look at him. Her eyes, hidden behind her frosted goggles, flicked to Sarah, who was leaning heavily on her ice axe, her head bowed in exhaustion. Eva had to warn her. She had to make the signal. But the mimic was between them, its hulking form a wall of potential violence. Every second of inaction was a gamble with their lives. The mimic, sensing the shift in her stillness, turned its head. "We should keep moving," it said, and the voice was Alex's, the same low, gravelly tone, but now Eva could hear the faint, hollow echo beneath it, the emptiness where a soul should have been. "Darkness is coming." It was in that moment that Sarah looked up, her medic's gaze sharpening as she caught the rigid terror in Eva's posture. Her eyes darted from Eva's face to the Alex thing and back again. She understood. The silent communication passed between them in a heartbeat. The confrontation was not a battle, it was an explosion. Eva gave a sharp, guttural cry, the prearranged signal for hostile. At the same moment, she lunged backward, creating distance. Sarah was a fraction of a second slower, her exhaustion betraying her. The mimic's reaction was not human. It didn't startle or question. Its face, the face of their friend, seemed to waver for an instant, the features blurring at the edges as its body uncoiled with a speed and grace the real Alex could never have possessed. It ignored Eva and went for Sarah, the perceived greater threat, the one who had first sensed the corruption in Liam. A hand that was no longer a hand, but a blur of pale, shifting tissue, shot out and grabbed Sarah by the front of her parka, lifting her off her feet with terrifying ease. She screamed, a short, choked sound, as she was hurled through the air like a doll, crashing into a hard-packed snowdrift 10 feet away with a sickening thud. Eva didn't see her land. Her world had narrowed to the thing wearing Alex's skin. It turned toward her, and now the mask was gone completely. The eyes were black pits, the mouth a lipless gash that pulled back into a silent snarl. It charged, no longer bothering with the pretense of humanity, its movement a low, predatory rush. She raised her rifle, but it was on her before she could fire, one arm smashing the weapon aside with a force that numbed her entire limb. The other hand, now a malformed claw of hardened chitinous material, swung for her head. She dropped, the air whistling where her skull had been, and rolled, coming up with her combat knife in her hand. The thing was impossibly fast, already pivoting, its form rippling as it adapted, preparing for another lunge. From the snowdrift, a gunshot roared. Sarah, her arm clearly broken, was propped on one elbow, her pistol held steady in her other hand. The round tore into the mimic's shoulder, spraying a jet of black viscous fluid that sizzled and steamed on the snow. The creature staggered, a sound like grinding rocks erupting from its throat. It was the distraction Eva needed. She surged forward, not away, driving her knife upward with all her strength, aiming for the base of its throat where the real Alex's armor would have had a seam. The blade sank in, meeting a strange resistance, like puncturing thick, frozen leather. The thing thrashed, its claws raking across her arm, tearing through the fabric and drawing blood that froze instantly. She held on, twisting the knife, feeling something vital tear inside the shifting mass. With a final, convulsive shudder, the form of Alex collapsed. It didn't fall like a man. It deflated, the human shape dissolving into the same pale, pulsating sludge they had captured in the dome. It writhed on the snow for a moment, its internal light flickering erratically, and then it lay still, the black fluid from its wounds pooling and freezing around it. Dark, ugly stain on the pristine white. Silence returned, broken only by Eva's ragged panting and Sarah's faint, pained gasps. The thing that had been Alex was gone, neutralized. But the victory was ashes in their mouths. They had not slain a monster, they had destroyed a ghost, a hollow shell wearing the face of a friend. The betrayal was complete, the loss absolute. They were down to two, alone in the vast white silence, with the chilling certainty that the entity's most devastating weapon was not its strength or its speed, but its perfect, soul-crushing lies. The silence after the mimic's death was a hollow, aching thing, filled only by the moan of the wind and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The thing that had worn Alex's face was now a dark, frozen stain on the snow, a grotesque monument to the entity's perfect, predatory lies. There was no time for grief, no moment to process the shattering of their final pillar of strength. The entity had taken Liam, it had taken Alex, and it had made it clear that their carefully planned trek was nothing more than a slow, deliberate harvest. They were being herded, driven like prey toward an unseen slaughter, their every move anticipated, their every bond weaponized against them. Eva helped Sarah to her feet, the medic's face pale with pain and shock, her left arm hanging at a useless, wrong angle. They shared a single, bleak look, a silent acknowledgement of their utter devastation. They were two now, against an ancient, intelligent foe that knew the landscape, knew their minds, and could wear any face it chose. The secondary station, Zulu 7, was still a distant, mocking promise on the horizon, a journey that now felt impossibly long and hopelessly exposed. They had barely taken a dozen stumbling steps from the site of the confrontation when the snow around them began to move. It was not the wind. It was a coordinated, rising motion from beneath the hard-packed surface. All around them, figures began to emerge. From the white, shedding cloaks of powder like actors taking the stage, they rose in a silent, chilling circle, cutting off any path of retreat. There were a dozen of them, perhaps more, and they all wore familiar faces. Liam stood there, his expression one of cold, analytical focus. Alex loomed, his features set in a mask of brute aggression. There were others, the frozen, terrified forms of the camp members they had found days ago, their faces now animated with a predatory awareness. And at the center of the semicircle, a perfect copy of Eva herself stared back, its gaze holding a flat, alien curiosity. It was a gallery of their dead, a chorus of stolen identities, and the message was unambiguous. There was no escape, no hope, no future. They were surrounded by the ghosts of their own failure. Eva and Sarah stood back to back, a tiny island of humanity in a sea of shifting, familiar horrors. They raised their weapons, but the gesture felt futile, a child's toy against an avalanche. The circle began to contract, the mimics moving with a silent, fluid synchronicity, their footfalls making no sound on the snow. The real Liam mimic took a step forward, its hand outstretched not in a threat, but in an offer, a perverse invitation to join the collective, to surrender their painful, individual selves to the perfect, cold unity of the hive. It was in that moment of utter, soul-crushing hopelessness that Liam, the real Liam, the one they had thought devoured by the storm, made his choice. He had not been taken. He had been hiding, using the chaos of the blizzard and his own technical skills to evade the mimics, observing their patterns, waiting for a moment of maximum impact. He had seen the entity's true nature, understood its hive-mind intelligence, and knew that a direct confrontation was suicide. But he also knew its weakness. It was centralized, a collective consciousness rooted in the physical mass buried beneath the ice. To wound the heart was to confuse the limbs. He emerged from a camouflaged hollow in a snowdrift 20 meters behind the ring of mimics, his parka crusted with ice, his face gaunt and resolute. In his hands, he held the missing plasma torch, now jury-rigged and wired to the last of their high-yield explosives, the entire assembly humming with unstable energy. He met Eva's eyes across the circle of monsters, and in that brief, silent exchange, he conveyed everything. An apology for the suspicion, a farewell to the team he had failed, and a final, desperate plan. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't say a word. He simply activated the torch. A searing blue-white jet of plasma erupted from the nozzle, not aimed at the mimics, but at the ground at his own feet. He drove the superheated beam downward into the ice, a suicidal act of creation, melting a direct conduit to the frozen world below. Then, with a final, grim smile, he dropped the entire, overloaded assembly into the newly formed borehole and threw himself on top of it. The explosion was not loud, it was deep. A subterranean thunder that vibrated up through the ice and into their bones. The ground beneath them bucked violently, throwing both mimics and humans to the snow. A brilliant, actinic light flashed from the hole Liam had created, followed by a geyser of black, steaming fluid and shattered organic matter. A single, unified shriek of psychic agony tore through the air, not a sound heard with ears, but a wave of pure, dissonant pain that lanced directly into their minds, a scream from 1,000 stolen voices as one. The circle of mimics dissolved into chaos. They did not flee. They convulsed, their forms flickering and melting, losing cohesion as the central intelligence that guided them reeled from the devastating blow to its core. The Eva mimic clawed at its own face, its features running like wet clay before it collapsed into a twitching, formless puddle. The others followed suit, their stolen identities sloughing away as the connection to the hive was violently severed. The light faded. The geyser of black fluid subsided, refreezing instantly into a grotesque, twisted sculpture. The psychic scream cut off, leaving a ringing silence that was more absolute than any they had yet experienced. Liam was gone, utterly. There was no body, no trace, only the smoldering, vitrified crater where he had made his stand. Eva pulled a stunned, weeping Sarah to her feet. There was no time to mourn, no time to comprehend the scale of the sacrifice. The path was clear now, the ring of mimics reduced to quivering, mindless sludge. Liam had not just bought them time, he had bought them a chance. He had wounded the ancient Leviathan in its heart, and in its pain it had momentarily loosened its grip. They stumbled forward through the dissolving remains of their nightmares, two survivors fleeing the epicenter of a sacrifice that had shaken the very foundations of the ice, their escape paid for with a final, terrible act of defiance against the silence. The world had been scoured clean by Liam's sacrifice, the explosion leaving behind a ringing silence that felt both sacred and cursed. The trek to Zulu 7, once a desperate flight through a gauntlet of phantoms, became a grim, mechanical procession through a landscape stunned into submission. The entity's presence, once a palpable pressure in the air and the snow, had receded, pulled back to tend to its wounded heart deep beneath the ice. The absence of its watchful, mocking intelligence was almost as unnerving as its presence had been. Eva and Sarah moved like automatons, their bodies pushed far beyond the limits of endurance, fueled only by the primal instinct to put distance between themselves and the crater that had swallowed Liam whole. Sarah's broken arm was a throbbing, frozen weight, and Eva's own wounds from the mimic's claws had stiffened, each step a fresh jolt of pain. They did not speak. Words were a currency they could no longer afford, a luxury for people who still had a future. The secondary station, when it finally materialized from the endless white, was not a beacon of hope, but a stark, geometric wound on the horizon. Zulu 7 was smaller than Miller's camp, a cluster of three low-slung modular buildings huddled around a single, skeletal communications mast, all of it painted a dull, non-reflective gray that seemed to absorb the weak light. No welcoming plume of smoke rose from its vents. No lights glowed from within its thick, triple-paned windows. Like the first camp, it was a still life, a diorama of abandonment. The only sign of movement was the wind-blown snow streaming from its rooftops like a ghostly banner. They approached with a caution born of shattered trust, their weapons held ready, their eyes scanning the pristine snow around the structures for any sign of footprints, any hint of life. There were none. The snow was a perfect, unbroken sheet, a blank page that told no stories of arrival or departure. The main airlock door, set into the side of the largest module, was sealed tight. Eva entered the access code from memory, her numb fingers fumbling on the frozen keypad. A green light blinked, and with a hiss of equalizing pressure, the heavy door swung inward, revealing a dark, cold antechamber. The air that washed over them was stale and frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of a place long sealed and lifeless. They stepped inside, their headlamps cutting twin beams through the absolute black. The antechamber was a utility space, lined with empty coat hooks and shelves meant for snow gear. Everything was in perfect, meticulous order, too perfect. Eva pushed through the inner door into the station's main habitation module, and the scene that greeted them was a chilling echo of the horror they had left behind. It was a carbon copy of Miller's camp, frozen in the same moment of abrupt cessation. A half-eaten meal sat on a central table, the food desiccated and frost-rimed. A data slate lay on it. Caught, its screen dark. A coffee mug stood beside a sink, its contents long since evaporated. But it was the walls that stopped the breath in their lungs. Carved into the insulated paneling covering nearly every available surface were the same symbols. The intricate spirals, the sharp angular lines, the repeating sequences of dots and dashes. They were here, etched with the same frantic, desperate energy. The message was not just at Miller's outpost. It was here, 60 kilometers away, a silent scream that had echoed across the ice. Sarah slumped against a bulkhead, a low, despairing moan escaping her lips. The sight of the symbols was a final, crushing blow. They had fought, they had bled, they had watched their friends die, all for the desperate hope of reaching a sanctuary, a place beyond the entity's reach. But the symbols proved the terrible, inescapable truth. There was no beyond. The threat was not localized. It had spread. The organism's influence, its psychic pollution, its network of mimicry and memory theft, was not confined to a single patch of ice. It was a cancer that had already metastasized across the continent, and Zulu 7 was not a refuge. It was just another infected cell in a vast, frozen body, another page in the same book of madness, its final chapter already written in a language of spirals and silence. The silence inside Zulu 7 was a different kind of predator. It wasn't the aggressive, listening silence of the open ice, but the deep, settled quiet of a tomb that had been sealed for a long time. The air was dead, so cold it felt brittle, and every sound they made, the crunch of frost under their boots, the rasp of their own breathing, echoed in the sterile, modular confines of the station. The carved symbols on the walls seemed to drink the light from their headlamps, the spirals and angular lines a visual static that hummed with malevolent history. This place was not a sanctuary. It was a reliquary, a confirmation that the horror they had fled was not an isolated incident but an epidemic. Driven by a desperate need for answers, for any thread of logic in the tapestry of madness, Eva went straight for the station's command console. The equipment was older, a generation behind Miller's outpost, coated in a fine layer of frost. The main power was dead, but the emergency backup, fed by a bank of geothermal batteries buried deep below the ice, still held a faint charge. With Sarah leaning against a bulkhead, cradling her broken arm and keeping a shattered watch on the sealed doors, Eva worked. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and exhaustion, bypassed the primary systems and tapped directly into the solid-state memory core, the station's black box. The data that scrolled across her portable screen was a ghost story written in ones and zeros. Zulu 7 had been a paleoclimatology station, its mission to drill even deeper than Miller's team, to pull up ice cores that held the atmospheric secrets of millions of years. The logs began normally, filled with the dry, technical language of science. Then the anomalies started. The same deep, resonant acoustic pulses, the same cryptic radio signals. They had recorded it all, their sensors far more sensitive, their analysis more thorough. They had even given it a name, a designation born from scientific detachment that now seemed horrifically quaint: cryogenic endolith X1. The final research entries, authored by a Dr. Isabel Petrova, were not the frantic scrawls of a mind unraveling like Miller's, but the cold, clinical observations of a scientist documenting her own extinction. Petrova described the discovery of the same luminous, filamentous structures in their deepest ice cores. She theorized that it was not a colony of organisms, but a single, vast, distributed entity, a macroorganism whose physical form was the entire ice sheet, a neural network of frozen tissue that had lain dormant since the planet's last great ice age. It was a relic from a time when the world was a ball of ice, a form of life that had ruled the frozen earth and had been forced into hibernation by the warming climate. Petrova's logs revealed the organism's life cycle, a terrifying process of propagation they had inadvertently triggered. It did not reproduce in any conventional sense. It propagated through assimilation. In its dormant state, it was a patient collector, its tendrils absorbing and storing the genetic and psychic imprints of any life that died and was preserved in its icy domain: long-extinct microbes, ancient plants, and now humans. The warming of the climate, the drilling, the vibrations of their machines. It was all an alarm clock ringing in a deep, frozen sleep. The entity was now awakening, and its awakening was a hunger. It was using its stored library of forms and memories to create the mimics, not as a weapon, but as a reproductive mechanism. Each perfect copy was a seed, a vessel designed to leave the ice, to infiltrate the teeming, warm world beyond and spread the entity's consciousness, terraforming the planet back into the frozen cradle it required to thrive. The final entry was a single, stark sentence from Dr. Petrova, time-stamped just minutes before all station systems went permanently offline. The hibernation is over. The propagation has begun. Eva leaned back from the screen, the cold of the station seeping past her suit and into her soul. The core discovery was not just an answer. It was a verdict on the entire human race. They weren't fighting a monster. They were fighting a world. An ancient, patient world that had once been the master of the planet and was now, after a long winter's sleep, ready to reclaim its throne. The mimics, the deceptions, the stolen faces. It was all just the first, tentative stretch of a leviathan awakening in the deep. A single, vast organism now turning its timeless, hungry gaze upon the fragile, temporary world of heat and noise that had dared to thrive in its absence. Truth was a colder, harder substance than the ice surrounding them, a revelation that froze the last vestiges of hope in their veins. The entity was not an intruder in their world. They were the temporary tenants in its frozen kingdom, and the lease had expired. Dr. Petrova's final log entry echoed in the tomb-like silence of Zulu 7, a prophecy of propagation that had already begun its work with Miller, with Alex, with Liam. Eva stood amidst the carved symbols, the spirals and sharp angles no longer just the ravings of a madman, but the genetic alphabet of a waking god, and knew that survival was no longer the goal. Containment was the only victory left to win, a desperate, last-ditch effort to build a wall against the coming ice. Her mind, battered and bleeding from days of psychological warfare, began to function with a cold, crystalline clarity, the commander's instinct overriding the human being's terror. Zulu 7, for all its haunted silence, was a treasure trove. It was a fully equipped research station, older but sturdier than Miller's camp, its systems designed for long-term autonomous operation. Its value was not in its shelter, but in its tools. Her eyes swept the module, cataloging resources with the ruthless efficiency of a field surgeon triaging the dying. The high-gain communications array on the roof, capable of punching a signal through the worst polar static. The bank of geothermal generators tapping into the planet's own heat, a source of power that would outlast their own dwindling supplies. The station's primary mainframe, its processors now cold and silent but whose architecture could be repurposed. The plan began to form, a desperate schematic drawn in the frost of her mind. It was a two-pronged assault, one aimed at the world outside, the other at the heart of the infection itself. The first objective was a distress signal, but not a plea for rescue. That would be a death sentence for any who answered, delivering fresh genetic material and warm bodies straight into the entity's waiting embrace. Instead, she would send a warning. A condensed data burst containing Petrova's research, the biological analysis of the tendrils, the recordings of the mimics and their own catastrophic losses. It would be a beacon of pure, undiluted truth, aimed not at McMurdo, but at the global monitoring networks, a scream into the void that this continent was to be quarantined, sealed, and if necessary, sterilized from orbit. It was a message that would brand her and Sarah as madwomen or martyrs, but it was the only way to prevent the propagation. The second objective was far more dangerous, a direct attack on the entity's local presence. The station's mainframe, if she could reboot and reprogram it, could be turned into a weapon. Liam's sacrifice had proven the entity was vulnerable to massive, disruptive energy surges. The geothermal generators provided the power. She could reroute it, overloading the system to create sustained, high-frequency electromagnetic pulse, a localized screech of digital noise designed to scramble the entity's delicate, hive-mind connections, to sever the psychic threads that bound the mimics to the core. It would not kill the ancient organism, but it might cripple its ability to project its consciousness to the surface, to create new mimics, buying precious time for the wider world to hear their warning and act. It was a containment protocol, a cage of pure energy built from the bones of a dead station. She explained it to Sarah in terse, unadorned sentences, the medic's face growing paler with each word. The plan was a suicide mission. Triggering the EMP would require a manual, physical override at the generator core, a chamber deep within the station that would be flooded with enough raw energy to cook anything inside. One of them would have to stay behind to throw the final switch, a human fuse in a circuit of last resort. Sarah listened, her good hand pressed against The bulkhead for support, her eyes, shadowed with pain and exhaustion, meeting Eva's. There were no arguments, no debates over who would make the sacrifice. The hierarchy of their shared ordeal had rendered such questions obsolete. Eva was the commander, the architect of the final stand. Sarah was the medic, the one who ensured the mission's objective was met. Her role was clear. She would have to be the one to survive, to carry the truth out of the ice, to bear witness to the horror so that the world might have a chance to prepare for the war to come. The unspoken agreement passed between them, a transaction more binding than any oath, sealed in the grim understanding that their partnership, forged in fire and ice, would end here, in the cold and the dark, one to die fighting the enemy, the other to live haunted by its echo. The final stand was no longer a concept. It was a countdown, and they had just started the clock. The plan was a fragile glass sphere in Eva's mind, and the first mimic to shatter the silence of Zulu 7 was the one that threw it against the wall. It did not come from outside, but from within, uncoiling from the shadowed corner of the communications room where the mainframe hummed with its new, lethal purpose. It was Sarah, or a thing that had studied Sarah's pain, her exhaustion, the precise way she favored her broken arm. It rose from a pool of shifting, pale sludge that had seeped through the floor grates, the features solidifying into a mask of perfect agony and desperation. "Eva," it gasped, its voice a broken mirror of the medic S. "The door, they're breaking through the main airlock. We have to run." The real Sarah was across the room, her back to the horror, her good hand working frantically at the communications console, uploading the condensed data burst of their warning. She froze at the sound of her own voice, a strangled cry catching in her throat. Eva did not hesitate. She did not look at the pleading, pain-racked face of her friend. She raised her sidearm and fired twice. The rounds tore into the mimic's chest, not with a spurt of blood but with a wet, tearing sound, and the figure collapsed backward, its form dissolving back into the ooze that slithered rapidly back through the grate, leaving only a sizzling black stain. That was the signal. The entity knew their location, their intention. The siege had begun. The station, once a tomb of quiet dread, became a cacophony of assault. From the ventilation shafts came a skittering, scrabbling sound, like a swarm of insects made of ice and bone. The heavy outer doors groaned under repeated massive impacts, the metal denting inward with each blow. Through the thick, triple-paned windows, figures began to appear in the swirling snow outside, a gallery of their dead and their own stolen faces, pressing against the glass with a silent, relentless hunger. Liam, Alex, Miller, even Eva herself, a parliament of ghosts hammering at their fragile fortress. Eva and Sarah fought a war on two fronts. Eva became a whirlwind of controlled violence, a soldier making her last stand. She moved from room to room, her weapon a staccato counterpoint to the pounding and the scratching. She fired at shapes that melted into the walls, at figures that burst from storage lockers, her aim true, her resolve a cold, hard diamond in her chest. Each mimic that fell dissolved into the same corrosive black fluid, but for each one neutralized, two more seemed to take its place. They were endless, a tide of personalized horror, and she was a single rock against the surge. Sarah, meanwhile, fought her own battle at the console, her broken arm a screaming distraction she forced into silence. Her world was the screen, the progress bar of the data upload, and the complex command sequence to prime the geothermal overload. Her fingers, slick with cold sweat, flew across the keyboard, bypassing safeties, rerouting power conduits, building the digital bomb that was their only legacy. Alarms blared as she pushed systems into the red, the station's own programming fighting her, a dead thing protesting its weaponization. The final stage of the plan demanded separation. The manual override for the EMP was in the generator core, a sublevel chamber sealed behind a heavy, shielded door. To trigger it was a one-way trip. Eva met Sarah's eyes across the chaos of the main module. The warning data burst was complete, its transmission initiated. A final, silent nod passed between them. An acknowledgement, a farewell, a passing of the torch. Sarah's role was to survive, to run, to get as far from the station as possible before the pulse erupted, and the mimics, hopefully disoriented and leaderless, would be at their most vulnerable. As Sarah slammed the final command into the console, initiating the station's self-destruct sequence as a secondary, physical failsafe, Eva turned and ran for the generator core. The hallway leading to it was a tunnel of nightmares. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, bulging with the shapes of struggling figures trying to break through. A mimic wearing Alex's form, half fused with the corridor wall, reached for her with a malformed claw. She sidestepped and fired, not breaking stride, the thing's roar of frustration echoing behind her. She reached the heavy door to the core, the metal already hot to the touch from the building energy within. She input the code, the mechanism groaning in protest. As the door hissed open, revealing the cavernous, humming chamber filled with the thrumming geothermal converters, she saw it. The central entity. It was not a mimic, not a copy. It was the source. It rose from the center of the chamber, a pillar of swirling, sentient frost. It had no fixed form, its shape a constantly shifting vortex of ice crystals and stolen light, but at its core glowed a concentration of that same sickly, greenish luminescence from the tendrils. Within that glow, she could see fragments of faces, heard whispers of 1,000 stolen memories, a churning nucleus of consumed identities. This was the local heart, the node of the hive mind they had wounded with Liam's sacrifice, and it had come to defend itself. The cold that radiated from it was not of this world. It was an absolute zero that stole the heat from the air, frosting Eva's visor instantly and making the metal of her rifle sear her hands with its sudden, intense chill. The entity did not attack. It simply existed, its presence a wave of psychic pressure that sought to freeze her mind, to shatter her will, to absorb her into its silent, perfect, frozen collective. This was the confrontation, not with a monster but with a concept. The concept of silence, the end of individuality, the victory of the ice. Eva felt her muscles locking, her thoughts slowing, a profound lethargy whispering for her to simply stop, to rest, to become part of the beautiful, cold unity. But she had one weapon it did not. She had extreme cold, and she had a purpose. Ignoring the rifle, now useless in her frozen hands, she stumbled toward the main override console, a single, isolated terminal in the center of the room, directly before the shifting pillar. The entity reacted, not with violence, but with a concentrated wave of pure cold. The air crystallized around her, the moisture in her breath freezing into a cloud of tiny daggers. Her suit's heaters screamed in protest and failed. The pain was excruciating, a million needles of ice piercing her skin. But she was prepared. She had saved the last of their liquid nitrogen, a small canister meant for preserving samples. With fingers that felt like brittle glass, she unclipped it, and screaming a raw, defiant sound that was torn away by the consuming silence, she sprayed the entire contents directly into the heart of the glowing nucleus. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The entity recoiled, its form shuddering violently. The green light flickered and dimmed. The whispers in her mind became a screech of dissonant agony. The extreme, localized cold of the liquid nitrogen, a manufactured absolute zero, was a poison to its ancient, frozen biology. It was a shock its system could not absorb, a sudden, violent theft of the very energy that sustained it. Weakened, disoriented, the pillar of frost lost cohesion, its form wavering, becoming translucent. In that moment of its distress, the psychic pressure vanished. Eva lunged the final few feet, her body screaming in protest, and slammed her hand down on the large, red override switch. A deafening hum filled the chamber, rising in pitch to an ear-splitting shriek. The lights died, and for a second there was only the sound of the building EMP and the frantic, fading pulse of the wounded entity. Then the world turned white, and then black, as a wave of pure, annihilating energy erupted from Zulu 7, sweeping outwards in a silent, invisible ring of digital death. And Eva Rostova was consumed by the heart of the storm she had unleashed. The silence that followed the pulse was not the empty quiet of the ice, nor the predatory hush of the entity's presence. It was the profound, deafening stillness of a world scoured clean. The electromagnetic scream had washed over the station and the surrounding miles of frozen waste, leaving behind a void where even the memory of sound seemed to have been erased. Inside the generator core, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and superheated metal, the geothermal converters now dark, dead monoliths in the sudden, absolute black. Eva Rostova lay on the cold floor, her body a map of agony, the final defiant act of triggering the override having drained the last of her strength. She was cold, a deep, internal cold that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air, a chill that felt like the echo of the entity's final touch. Miraculously, she was alive. The shielded core had protected her from the brunt of the energy surge, though every nerve ending felt. Scorched, her mind a raw, blank slate. She pushed herself up, her movements slow and painful, her headlamp flickering back to life to pierce the gloom. The pillar of sentient frost was gone. In its place was a spreading, glassy patch on the floor, as if the rock and metal had been flash vitrified. Of the central entity there was no trace, only a lingering, psychic scar in the air, the ghost of a scream that had been cut short. Her gambit with the liquid nitrogen and the EMP had worked. She had wounded the heart, and in its moment of vulnerability, she had severed its connection to the world above. Stumbling out of the core, she found the station transformed. The relentless pounding and scratching had ceased. The mimics that had been pressing against the windows were gone, their forms dissolved into inert, frozen sludge that was already being covered by the drifting snow. The station was a tomb once more, but now it was a tomb of her own making, a monument to a battle fought and for. The moment won. She moved through the haunted corridors, her weapon held loosely in her numb hand, but there was nothing left to fight. The hive mind's local consciousness had been scrambled, the puppets left without their master, collapsing back into the primordial ooze from which they were formed. She found Sarah outside, crouched in the lee of a fuel silo 100 yards from the station. The medic was shivering violently, her face pale and etched with a pain that went far beyond her broken arm. She had witnessed the pulse from a distance, seen the station's lights die and the mimics dissolve, and had held her position, following her last order to survive. When Eva emerged from the ruined airlock, a lone figure in the vast white, the two women simply stared at each other across the distance. There were no words of celebration, no tears of relief. Their shared look was one of hollowed-out recognition, a silent understanding of the price that had been paid. They were the only ones left. The elite rescue team was gone, their faces and voices now part of the entity's grisly collection, their sacrifices a permanent stain on the ice. Together, they performed the final, grim duty. Using the last of their strength and the station's remaining functional equipment, they sealed the borehole Liam had created with his sacrifice, packing it with high-grade explosives from Zulu 7's mining cache. They then did the same to the station's own excavation site and the entrance to the generator core. The subsequent, controlled detonation sent deep, percussive shudders through the ice, collapsing the tunnels and chambers, entombing the physical evidence of the horror and the frozen, twitching remains of the neutralized mimics under thousands of tons of rock and ice. They were not scientists, they were soldiers, and their mission was now containment. They were building a cairn over a grave, hoping the ice would keep its secret for a little while longer. As the last echoes of the demolition faded, a profound exhaustion settled over them. They stood at the edge of the sealed zone, two tiny figures against an ocean of white, the truth of the mimicry a cold, hard stone in each of their chests. They were haunted not by ghosts but by absences. The memory of Alex's strength turned against them. The echo of Liam's logic used as a lure. The knowledge that the entity's most terrifying weapon was its perfect, intimate understanding of its prey, its ability to wear a friendly face and speak with a stolen voice. They had survived the physical threat, but the psychological wound was deep and festering. They had looked into the heart of a predator that consumed identities, and a part of them would forever remain in that frozen, silent place, wondering if the face they saw in the reflection was truly their own, or just another layer of the ice's perfect, patient lie. The sound began as a distant, mechanical thrum, a vibration felt through the ice long before it was heard. After days of a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, the noise was an intrusion, a violation of the frozen peace they had carved with sacrifice and fire. Eva lifted her head from where she sat propped against a supply crate, her body a single, unified ache. Sarah, drowsing fitfully beside her, jerked awake, her good hand instinctively scrabbling for a weapon that was no longer there. Their eyes met across the dim interior of Zulu 7's least damaged module, a silent, wary exchange. Hope was a dangerous, unfamiliar currency, and they had been bankrupted by lies. The thrum resolved into the distinct rhythmic beat of helicopter rotors. Through the grime-caked window, a dark shape grew against the bleached sky, a search and rescue Chinook, its twin rotors churning the air into a frenzy. It circled the station once, a predatory bird assessing carrion, then settled onto a relatively flat expanse of snow 100 meters away, its landing skis sinking deep into the powder. The world outside, which had been a canvas of pure white and silent dread, was now filled with the roaring, diesel-scented reality of their own kind. Eva and Sarah emerged from the station like ghosts stepping into the light, shielding their eyes against the blown snow. They moved slowly, their postures stiff with exhaustion and injury. The rescue team that disembarked from the Chinook was a blur of efficient movement and bright colors, their faces hidden behind goggles and oxygen masks. They were a stark contrast to the two haggard, frost-grimed survivors, their movements crisp and professional, devoid of the haunted hesitation that now defined Eva and Sarah's every gesture. A medic rushed forward, his questions rapid and clinical, his hands already assessing Sarah's splinted arm and Eva's various cuts and frostbite. During the flight back to McMurdo, cocooned in the heated, vibrating belly of the helicopter, the debriefing began. It was conducted by a stern-faced mission coordinator named Shaw, who listened with a notebook and a penetrating gaze. Eva, her voice a hoarse, rasping thing, delivered the official report. She stuck to the bones of the truth, a skeleton stripped of its terrifying flesh. She spoke of a catastrophic blizzard, of structural collapse at Miller's camp, of the tragic losses of Liam and Alex to the unforgiving environment. She described their desperate trek to Zulu 7, their find of the abandoned station, and a subsequent localized seismic event that had forced them to detonate charges to seal unstable ground. It was a story of man versus nature, a tale of heroic failure against a hostile continent. It was clean. It was believable. It was a lie woven from the tattered threads of reality. She made no mention of the symbols carved into the walls. She did not speak of the shifting, gelatinous masses, the faces of friends worn by predators, or the ancient, hive-mind intelligence sleeping in the ice. When Shaw pressed on the specific cause of the seismic event and the strange, vitrified patch near Zulu 7, Eva's gaze did not waver. She cited unknown geothermal activity, a pocket of methane gas, anything that would fit within the established, comfortable narrative of Antarctic danger. To speak the full truth would be to invite panic, to be labeled insane, to see the continent locked down not for safety, but for a frantic, foolish dissection that would only awaken the entity fully and deliver countless more souls into its waiting, silent embrace. The greater rescue was not their own extraction, but the containment of the knowledge they carried. Sarah supported the fiction with a medic stoic calm, her corroboration clinical and detached. She detailed their physical injuries, the effects of extreme cold and exhaustion, letting the tangible evidence of their ordeal sell the simpler, safer story. She spoke of Liam's dedication, of Alex's strength, painting them as heroes lost to the ice, their memories sanctified by a lie. Inside, she felt the weight of the omission like a tumor, a secret that now lived and breathed between her and Eva, a shared burden that would forever isolate them from the world they were returning to. When they finally touched down at McMurdo, the base was a whirlwind of controlled activity. They were ushered into the medical bay, their story already spreading through the grapevine, a tragic, but ultimately understandable Antarctic drama. The full, horrifying truth of the mimicry, of the identity-devouring entity, remained locked behind their eyes, a silent scream in a room full of normalcy. They had been rescued from the ice, but they were returning to the world as living tombs, carrying a secret as cold and vast as the continent they had left behind, a truth too terrible to speak, buried deep beneath the frozen layers of an official report, designed to ensure that no one else would ever have to learn what it meant to have your own face turned against you. The warmth was the first. It settled over Eva's skin in her sterile apartment, a dry, artificial heat pumped through vents, a pathetic imitation of the sun's embrace. It felt foreign, a violation after the profound, honest cold of the ice. She stood in the center of her living room, a space filled with the comfortable, curated detritus of a life she no longer recognized, a framed photo of her team, smiling in the New Zealand sun before the deployment, a bookshelf of novels she had once loved, a potted fern, now brown and brittle from neglect. These objects were supposed to be anchors, pulling her back to the woman she had been. Instead, they felt like props on a stage, a carefully constructed diorama of a person who had ceased to exist somewhere on the frozen plain between Miller's Camp and Zulu 7. The silence of her apartment was the second, more insidious lie. It was not the vast, listening silence of the ice, but a dense, urban quiet, punctuated by the distant hum of traffic, the muffled thump of a neighbor's music, the drip of a faucet. Her mind, honed by weeks of hypervigilance, parsed each sound, not as background noise but as a potential threat. The scuff of a shoe in the hallway outside her door was not a neighbor returning home. It was the wet, slithering approach of a mimic testing her perimeter. The murmur of voices from the television was not a news broadcast. It was the whispered, psychic echo of the hive mind, searching for a crack in her sanity. Paranoia was no longer a symptom. It was her fundamental state of being. It bloomed in the most mundane moments. At the grocery store, she saw a man in the frozen foods aisle, his back to her, his posture and build a perfect match for Alex. Her breath hitched, her hand twitching toward the absent weapon at her hip. When he turned, it was a stranger's face, his eyes glazed with the boredom of a weekly chore. The relief was immediate, but it was followed by a deeper, more chilling dread. The entity was a perfectionist. The next one would not make that mistake. Worse were the reflections. She would catch her own face in a darkened window or the glossy surface of her microwave, and for a heart-stopping second she wouldn't recognize herself. The eyes looking back would seem flat, the expression a little too still, the smile, if she forced one, a fraction of a second too slow to form. Was that truly her? Or was it the thing, the mimic, having finally succeeded, having worn her down and worn her skin, now standing in her apartment, performing the rituals of a life it had consumed? She would press her fingers to her own cheek, feeling the solidity of bone and flesh beneath, the verification tap a frantic internal rhythm. Left shoulder, right. I am me. I am me. She found herself studying the people around her with a terrifying, clinical intensity. She watched her therapist, noting the slight twitch of a finger, the rhythm of a blink, the cadence of a question. Was the empathy in her voice genuine, or a flawless copy learned from 1,000 absorbed sessions? She watched the barista who made her coffee, the mailman, the strangers on the subway. She looked for the tells, the infinitesimal cracks in the human facade that the entity, in its alien perfection, might miss. A laugh that didn't reach the eyes. A gesture that was a microsecond out of sync. Everyone was a potential shell, a hollow mannequin waiting for the signal from the ice to shed its skin and reveal the shifting horror within. The most profound haunting was the internal one. She questioned her own humanity, her own memories. Were the cherished moments of her childhood truly hers, or were they psychic debris, absorbed by the entity and now echoing in a mind it was slowly colonizing? When she felt a surge of grief for Liam, for Alex, was it her own heart breaking, or was it the entity's perfect mimicry of emotion, a tool to keep her compliant, to make her believe she was still human? The line between her own consciousness and the collective memory of the hive mind had been blurred in that frozen generator core, and she could never scrub the stain of that contact clean. She was back in the world, surrounded by life and noise and warmth, but Eva Rostova was more isolated than she had ever been on the ice. She was a ghost in her own life, a sentinel guarding a truth too terrible to speak, forever watching the faces of the world, wondering which one would be the next to melt away and reveal the ancient, silent, hungry thing lurking beneath the skin of reality. The mission was over, the rescue complete, but she had never truly left the ice. A part of her would always be there, frozen in that final, desperate stand, forever haunted by the reflection in the snow and the terrifying question it posed. In a world of perfect copies, how could you ever be sure you were the original? The world had moved on, a fact Eva observed from the sterile remove of her new existence. Life in the city was a river of noise and motion, a frantic current that flowed around the island of her trauma without ever touching its shores. She performed the rituals of normalcy with the precision of an automaton, attending mandated therapy sessions, collecting her military pension, buying groceries from brightly lit supermarkets that felt like alien spacecraft. She existed in a state of perpetual, low-grade dissociation, her true self still stranded on the ice, forever watching the blizzard rage and the mimics shift. The warmth of her apartment, the taste of fresh food, the sound of laughter from a nearby park, all of it felt like a fragile, painted scrim over a bottomless abyss of white silence. It was during one of these dissociative episodes, seated on her stiff new sofa with the television flickering as background noise, that the echo found her. A news channel was running a segment on unexplained global phenomena, a filler piece between weightier stories of politics and finance. The anchor's voice was a smooth, professional drone discussing a series of minor, bizarre events, a cluster of electronic malfunctions in a remote Siberian town, a spate of missing persons in the Canadian Rockies who had left behind all their possessions, a strange, lichen-like growth found spreading over ancient stone circles in Scotland. The report was framed with a light, almost whimsical tone, the kind reserved for stories too odd to be taken seriously. Then, the screen filled with a photograph. It was a close-up of the strange growth on the Scottish stones, a deep purple-black substance with a complex crystalline surface texture. The camera zoomed in, and there, nestled within the intricate frost-like pattern of the growth, was a symbol, a sharp angular spiral interlocking with a series of precise dots and dashes. Eva's breath froze in her lungs. The world, the apartment, the drone of the television, it all vanished, sucked into the vortex of that single, familiar image. The air grew thin, the room tilting on its axis. It was the same symbol, the exact same configuration of lines and spirals that had been carved with frantic desperation into the walls of Miller's camp and Zulu 7. The symbol from Sergeant Miller's journal, the one that had colonized his mind before the entity consumed his body. It was not a random pattern, it was a signature, a brand. A cold that had nothing to do with the climate-controlled room seeped from her marrow, coating her insides in a familiar, ancient frost. The containment had failed. Their sacrifices, their lies, the desperate demolition of the sites, it had all been for nothing. The propagation was not a localized event they had stalled. It was a global process they had merely failed to notice. The entity was not just in Antarctica. Its influence, its spores, its consciousness was spreading, seeding itself in the remote, cold places of the world, tapping into new sources of genetic material, new minds to absorb and identities to wear. The Siberian malfunctions, the Canadian disappearances, they weren't isolated oddities. They were symptoms. The first, quiet coughs of a planet-wide infection. She sat there, paralyzed, as the news segment moved on to a story about a celebrity wedding. The cheerful music and bright images felt like a personal assault, a grotesque parody of a world blissfully unaware of the cancer growing in its flesh. The echo of the silence from the ice was now a roar in her ears, a tidal wave of dread that drowned out the trivial noise of the television. The organism's reach was expanding, its ancient, patient intelligence weaving itself into the fabric of the world, and she and Sarah were the only two people on Earth who knew the true nature of the shadow falling across it. They had survived the battle, but the war for the soul of the planet had just begun, and they were its sole, terrified sentinels, watching the first, faint symbols of the end appear on the evening news.